In order to properly break down the Borg, we need to understand the foil that is presented to them, namely the United Federation of Planets. When you break down these two factions, they both have similar goals, especially in later Trek. While Jean-Luc says humanity, I think it's reasonable to assume that this was for the benefit of Lily. While contamination of the timeline has already occurred, he doesn't need to go too far in depth. And I think if you look in previous episodes, you'll see that this stands true, where he'll go so far but no farther. Ultimately, what he's saying here is that the United Federation of Planets is trying to better itself, to become superior. The Borg have the exact same goal. Both entities are just going about it differently. The Federation, in theory at least, is built on ideas and exploring what you think. That everyone is free to pursue whatever they want to pursue. That the height of humanity and the height of the Federation makes them want to make their lives better for the next generation. The Borg, similarly, do want to improve. They do this by assimilation, to gain perfection, to enslave and utilize the collective to attain what they want. Their entire culture is geared towards the same goals as the Federation. They just do it in a different way. Ironically, I think that we see initially that the Borg's culture, the way they do things, is far superior to that of the Federation. Before we get into that though, let's break down the Federation up to the point of meeting the Borg. I've discussed this before, but we know that the United Federation of Planets was founded by 4 core members: the Tellarites, Andorians, Vulcans, and humans. Of these core 4 worlds, I don't think it's a stretch to say that at least 3 of them were conceited and arrogant, and possibly it was probably all 4. Though their superior attitudes would of course vary by degrees. The progenitor organization that ultimately would form the Federation would not be without its own controversies. But even with these issues, from that, a proliferation would occur. It would turn into the Federation, and this Federation would expand in all directions. New species and worlds would join and create new technologies. It would be a time of exploration and scientific endeavor. The Federation, and by extension Starfleet, would look at the galaxy as something to be marveled at, to be studied. People would begin to focus solely on their own pursuits, and then the ideals of the Federation would be challenged, and that ideal would fail. Though ultimately Starfleet would win due to, we'll go with improbable, circumstances. And after this victory, it would move into an era of a Federation-Klingon Cold War. Though even with this Cold War, this would be the beginning of a quote-unquote utopia. Species of all kinds would again come together to begin exploring again, to search out new life and new civilizations. To not just find answers to the questions they had, but to find new questions. And then, the Federation would effectively win the Cold War. I've talked about it quite a bit, but the time after would see the United Federation of Planets entering into a very pacifistic stage. Now, Lore Runner has called this time the Golden Age, and that's not inaccurate. In fact, the reason that Starfleet stopped believing itself a military, it started having families on their ships, and they were so pompous, was because they really had no true enemies. The Klingons were now allies, the Cardassians were a regional threat at best, and the Romulans hadn't really poked their heads out. And it's really easy to see an alliance ultimately forged in combat, challenged and beaten to near annihilation to only come back and defeat the enemy that was going to destroy them, would become apathetic after hundreds of years of having won. They were sitting on their laurels and enjoying the good life. You can even see such a pompous attitude with Picard challenging Q. And this is ultimately where the Federation would meet its foil. Unlike the Federation, the Borg consumed everything it came across. Effectively, they were bred from war and conflict and were in a constant state of fighting. They didn't fall into any apathetic stage, so where the Federation utilized its freedoms to become soft, the Borg didn't. But I tell you what, let's get into, at least a little bit, the encounter between the Borg and the Enterprise. The encounter between the Enterprise and the Borg would change the Federation forever. But here's a question. Did Q send the Enterprise to an older Borg cube that the Enterprise would have an easier time with so they could survive and go back and tell the rest of the Federation? Bonus question. Do you think the confrontation changed the Borg? When the Enterprise first meets the cube, the Borg begin dissecting the Galaxy-class ship for information and causing damage to it. They learn about the Federation and what it has achieved. And according to Q at least, they only want the ship. This opens up some interesting questions, and I intend to break down this cube specifically in the next video. However, I do question how the Borg operated beforehand. Did humanity and the Federation change them? We do know that they did already have assimilation technology and transwarp gates and were able to travel via transwarp, but it seems like this ship was different, or at least the way they operated was different. I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. In the last episode, we discussed how the Federation and the Borg were basically foils of each other. Both factions wanted to be more than the sum of their parts to improve and help make the universe a better place. They just had drastically different ways of going about it. While the Borg were constantly in the midst of conflict, attempting to assimilate and change everyone they meet. Or at least their technology. We'll get into that in a minute. The Federation wanted to explore and analyze their own individuality. Unfortunately for the Federation, when Starfleet had finally pushed back all of its enemies, those within Starfleet and the UFP became apathetic. They began exploring further into the galaxy, but not preparing for what was out there, for what was to come. In short, Starfleet was woefully unprepared for what they would bump up against. The fact that the Federation had become unchallenged meant that they would become pompous and arrogant. Starfleet would continue to expand, but again, not prepare for what they were expanding into. They would move too far, too fast. However, in the TNG episode Q Who, all of that would change. Thanks to Q, the Enterprise D would be pushed well beyond the borders of the Federation, well past where Starfleet had already explored. This would ensure that the first, well, quote-unquote, first interaction between the Federation and the Borg would occur. The conflict between the Enterprise D and the Borg cube would be interesting, to say the least. The cube that the Enterprise would come across would not act entirely consistent with what we see in future iterations of the Borg. It's very important to note that we do have some indication that the Borg were already aware of both the Federation and the Romulans long before this encounter. As I had stated, Q had pushed the Enterprise D so far that it would take over 2 years for them to return back to Federation territory. Deciding to do some exploring first, because Picard opted to be an idiot instead of get his people home, the Enterprise comes across a planet that appeared to have some form of civilization. However, most of this civilization's structures had been consumed, in patterns consistent with what was happening along the Romulan neutral zone. It's possible that the Borg had begun scouting Federation space after receiving the signal they would have gotten in Star Trek Enterprise's regeneration. Given that there wasn't more of a push against either government at this time, it's likely that the Borg had not found neither the Federation nor the Romulans worthy of assimilation, or again, at least their technology worthy of assimilation, similar to how the Borg felt about the Kazon initially. However, after scouting the Federation, finding them lacking, all of a sudden a Starfleet vessel is 7,000 light years away from where it should be. This would be an amazing jump in propulsion technology. It was also something that the Borg weren't aware of the Federation having capabilities of when they were scouting the territory. So after detecting the Starfleet ship, a cube is assigned to investigate why it was so far away from Federation space. This would also explain why the Borg, which beam onto the Enterprise while its shields are up, by the by, seem to only focus on the engines of the Enterprise. They are attempting to figure out how the Galaxy-class starship would have gotten so far from home. After scanning the ship and its computer systems, the Borg still aren't able to determine how the vessel had got there. So the collective decides they will assimilate the ship in an attempt to try to better understand how this could have occurred. As stated, the differences in firepower are astronomical. While the initial attack by the Enterprise D is highly effective against the Borg, the ship would ultimately begin to repair itself. After this, we see no weapon utilized by the Enterprise D that is effective against the Borg cube. It's clear that Starfleet was absolutely no match for the Borg collective. And then, when the Borg were about to completely assimilate the ship, Q saves the Enterprise and it disappears. Again, not only does this vessel appear to have technology that the Borg can't detect, but seems to be far superior to that of what the Borg can do themselves. In short, the Borg had already known about Starfleet, and now we had a ship and technology that was completely counter to everything they knew. In my last episode, I asked if Starfleet had changed the Borg. I wonder if the answer to that question is yes. The Anti-Trekker, who has his own series on the Borg, it'll be in the description below, you should check it out, basically agrees with this assumption, that the Borg didn't really assimilate people until the interaction with the Enterprise D. This would make some amount of sense when you think about it. Even if we take regeneration into account, the Borg receive a message from an unknown ship, are given coordinates to an unknown world for some reason, and begin investigating that area of space. They start scooping up several different colonies from the Romulans and the Federation and don't find any technology really worthy of their time. And then the Enterprise D appears out of nowhere. Not only do they now see a propulsion system that they didn't know existed, but also somehow the Federation had kept it a secret from them. So the Borg get curious. Obviously, they aren't able to gain the knowledge they need from the tech itself, so they do something that they rarely did. They begin assimilating the people of the civilizations. They capture Picard and assimilate him, utilizing more antiquated techniques of the time, and discover that the Federation doesn't possess the propulsion systems they thought. This would mean that they either find out about the Q at this time or learn more about the species. However, even though they didn't find the propulsion systems they wanted, the mentality of the Borg was already forever changed. They now see the advantages to not only assimilating technology, but the people en masse. This is where we begin to see them use the more advanced nanoprobe technology, which I still hold may have been something they got from Federation citizens. As I stated before, the discussions have always centered around the Federation, how this changed them, and how Wolf 359 was a wake-up call. But I'm beginning to think that the interactions went both ways, that it changed the Borg forever as well. In the last video, we discussed how the Borg Collective might have been fundamentally changed by the Federation. Whether you believe in this theory or not, it's undeniable that we see a change in the Borg from their presence in the Next Generation to that of Voyager. The change can be so drastic that many will just pick and choose what Borg behavior type they like, and get upset when you bring up other instances of them acting contradictory. I personally think that these changes can be explained simply by the assimilation process. It would make sense that if the Borg rarely assimilated and then began to assimilate en masse, that they would change drastically. If we assume that they always assimilated en masse, then these changes still make sense. As they move towards quote-unquote perfection, change would take place. Additionally, the differences in the Borg that we see could also be attributed to the inadequacy of Starfleet technology. When the Enterprise D first encounters the Borg, they detect no weapons and no life forms. However, this could either be due to this specific Borg cube or Starfleet tech unable to distinguish anything at that point. The first few encounters with the Borg would show them to be a type of cybernetic life form that acted in tandem, one mind, one voice. They appeared to be interconnected with the ship, not on the ship, but a part of the ship. This would allow several advantages, including instantaneous decision-making and quick ship movement as a couple of examples. The Borg would also be able to adapt to most any type of technology they encountered, including weapons that, once used, would become ineffective. The Borg cube, at least the one they first encounter, would also be able to repair itself. The Borg in the beginning were very alien to anything the Federation had encountered. The Collective didn't care about diplomacy, nor did they really care about any one thing specifically. They just consumed. As discussed in the last episode, the Borg became very intrigued with the Federation after a Starfleet ship somehow was able to appear out of nowhere, and then escape after being captured, with no explanation how they possessed such advanced technology. This led the Borg to decide the assimilation of the Federation was necessary. Before they would assimilate Earth and ultimately the Federation, the Borg opted to do something very peculiar. They would chase the Enterprise, not to assimilate it, nor to destroy it, but to capture one person, Jean-Luc Picard. For anyone who doesn't like my theory that the Federation changed the Borg, rewatch Best of Both Worlds. In this episode, they specifically state that the Borg do not assimilate individuals, that they assimilate civilizations, that this was something new. Now again, I could be wrong, but this is a strong piece of evidence that they did not go after or assimilate specific people. Again, the Borg are acting inconsistent with everything we've seen before, and even what we would see in the future in some instances. Now, it's possible that the Borg identified Captain Picard of the Enterprise and theorized he, above all else, would be able to explain how the Enterprise D was able to escape like it did. Once Picard was assimilated, they determined that it was Q that did it, and thus decided just to continue on into the Federation, which would lead to the encounter at Wolf 359. The Battle of Wolf 359 was one of the most terrifying points for the Federation. Even more perplexing is the Borg mindset. When you look at how the Collective acts in the battle, again, it's truly alien, it's truly terrifying. It's scary how much the Borg lack any concern or care. The Collective, in this scenario, were simply following a computerized objective: assimilate Earth and then the Federation. They didn't care about the individual past Picard, just the whole. It was a math equation. When you look at the Battle of Wolf 359 itself, it's terrifying. The Borg just attack the ships to get them out of the way. They don't care about the people that they're hurting. The extreme emotion of the Federation officers juxtaposed at the callousness of the Borg is really good writing. And then when we look at other instances, when the Enterprise personnel or others beam aboard the Borg cube, they are found by a computer program to be insignificant and thus ignored. They only become a threat, and the Borg only care when they begin attacking systems on the Borg cube, causing damage to the ship. The Borg don't care about you. They only care about the whole. They're laser focused, and they only care about what some algorithm tells them to. Everything else is insignificant. The loss of life and the destruction of everything you hold dear, your home, your family, your friends, isn't a part of their program and thus ignored. However, confusingly, they still collect their dead and still seem to care on some superficial level about their own. If one of the drones of the Borg cube was hurt or in distress, they would either stop what they are doing or travel around the universe to find them. It mattered what happened to the individual, even if the individual didn't matter. The Borg was a collective, a whole. What was impacted to one impacted them all. Somehow, the Borg lacked any humanity, but seemed to be human when it came to their own drones. At least from what can be seen from the standpoint of the Federation during this period, which again makes them both confusing and scary in my opinion. However, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the various retcons that we observed from the movie First Contact and that of Voyager. While we never see her, the Queen would be a part of the Borg cube, playing a vital role in attempting to assimilate Earth, even though Picard talks to the collective and not her in the actual episode. We also have assimilated crew from Wolf 359, even though the Enterprise D comes in and their sensors say that everyone is dead, because that makes sense. Now, I guess if I want to be fair, it's possible that there were Borg survivors that had been assimilated on various ships at this point. We know that the Federation sensors had problems discerning Borg life signs at this stage. Additionally, it's possible that right after the Battle of Wolf 359, the Borg launched a sphere with the Queen on it, making sense why she wasn't on the cube, even if Jean-Luc Picard says she's on the cube in the movie. We know at least one ship wasn't destroyed on Starfleet's side, so it's also possible that this ship was assimilated and sent back to the Delta Quadrant for study. As stated, the Borg cube would be defeated by the Enterprise when Jean-Luc Picard is captured, and thus the Borg cube cares about what's happening to one of their own. After the collective was defeated by the Enterprise D, the next time we see the Borg is an interaction with a drone named Hugh. After finding a downed Borg ship, there was one survivor. This survivor's name would be known as, wait for it, Hugh. If you're interested in giving your opinion on whether Picard should have sent a virus back with Hugh or not, click in the top right-hand corner where we put him on trial. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. Hugh was sent back with his individuality intact. Now here's an interesting problem. When Hugh returned, he caused issues within the Borg, even causing a schism. He brought disorder to unity. However, what's interesting about this, well, why didn't Picard bring disorder to unity as well? So the Borg have certain measures in place to remove individuality from a newly assimilated Borg, but not a previous one. If that's true, why didn't we see this issue in the Voyager episode, Survival Instinct? This is where Seven and 3 other Borg were freed. They started having their own individuality again. Seven, being only a little girl when she was assimilated, only ever knew the Borg, and so she utilized Borg tech to force the others back into the collective, which, by the way, is just savage, Seven, but still. We never see any issues when it comes to that. Now, it's possible that after Hugh measures were taken, but that just seems weird. Unless you take my theory where the Federation changed them and they began assimilating en masse again and thus had to worry about these measures. I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts? In the last few episodes, I discussed how the Borg may have been changed by the Federation, Borg interactions, the Battle of Wolf 359, and a little bit about Hugh. This video will be more a focus on Hugh and his rebellion. For those who don't remember, Hugh was a survivor from a crash of a Borg vessel that was found by the Enterprise crew. Thanks to the power of stupidity, Picard decided not to send Hugh back with a virus that would have saved millions of lives. He thought that sending Hugh back as an individual might have been enough. We catch up with Hugh in the TNG episode Descent Part 2. As Picard predicted, the dialogue of the episode does indicate that the individuality of Hugh did indeed impact the Borg, that his individuality was like a virus that spread viciously. Though, if I'm honest, dialogue is confusing as we aren't really sure if it was the entirety of the collective or just his cube. At least not in the beginning. Hugh discusses how the Borg were all one voice, smooth and flowing, but with his return, the voices began to have disunity. Again, it's interesting that when they assimilate Picard, this doesn't happen, but a reintegrated Borg comes back and all of a sudden, it's an issue. This discordance would allow Lore, not me, but this one, to dominate a small amount of Borg. Turn them into slaves once again. Ironically, at the beginning, the dialogue would make you think that it was most all of the Borg, even though it doesn't seem to be the case with how many Borg we see on screen. And ultimately, dialogue will lead us to believe that it was only a few Borg. However, looking at the ones that were impacted, the Borg, at least the ones with Hugh, were completely lost after his return. Borg would fight Borg, some starving to death as they shut themselves down completely. And then, when Lore, that one not me, offered a single voice for them to obey, they followed his hope of salvation. Also, for anyone who hasn't, I would suggest rewatching the entire TNG two-parter Descent and Descent Part 2. It's curious to see how the Borg act in these episodes. In several scenes, you can see the Borg interacting with each other, talking to each other, and doing tasks we would expect to see other species doing. They've been completely individualized. And again, during these scenes, a lot of the dialogue would seem to indicate that it was the Borg in their entirety that was impacted. That is, until the end when it's made clear it was just the specific Borg. If I had to guess, I would probably think that the cube that Hugh was on was corrupted. The collective, realizing what was going on, cut them off. Those that survived were found by Lore, him not me, and they assimilated a different ship. This would explain why the vessel encountered by Enterprise was so different and didn't match known configurations of the collective and is never seen again. It's also possible that the individuality perhaps spread to the Borg in this specific quadrant. This would explain why the Borg don't have any major presence within the Alpha and Beta quadrants after this episode. The Borg stopped the spread of individuality into the Delta quadrant by cutting off the Alpha and Beta quadrants. Honestly, I think they really missed an opportunity here. If you're going to have a Borg Queen, and honestly, why God, why? But if you were going to have one, you could have had her come or appear as a part of what happened to Hugh. Don't have her always exist like we see in First Contact. The way you bring in some continuity and a callback to that episode is to make her a requirement to bring unity back to disunity, order back to chaos. It would have been fun to see how Q intricately changed the Borg. But I don't know. I just break this stuff down. I don't write for CBS. However, focusing back on Hugh and the stragglers, Lore, him not me, would bring order to chaos. Unfortunately, it would be at a cost as he began to experiment on the Borg who trusted him. Hugh and many of the others would ultimately rebel and break free of Lore's machinations. In doing so, they would also help the USS Enterprise D in liberating their captured crew. After we see the Enterprise D leaving, there is no alpha canon on what occurred to Hugh and his Borg. Though, I can already hear the typing for those who have played Star Trek Online or have read several book explanations as I speak. Again, it's never really been addressed, but some of the popular beta canon includes Hugh and company joining the cooperative in the Delta Quadrant, and other lore has him even forming his own nation and helping to heal those who are terminally ill, turning them into independent Borg if they wanted to, and waging a war against the collective. All interesting ways for them to go that I would love to see in Alpha Canon. But again, from an Alpha Canon perspective, what I find curious is that Starfleet didn't take advantage of this monumental opportunity. You have an independent Borg that can't go back to the collective and need help. You're telling me that Starfleet wouldn't reach out in hopes of learning about Borg technology and trade for helping these new people become a nation. This was a definitive way that Starfleet could have ensured that they knew how to defend against a Borg attack. But alas, they just left them to their fate. No other communications that we are aware of. As the next video will lead into the First Contact movie, I'm going to take a moment to address a theory that's interesting, but has some contradictions in it. There is a theory that the Borg are farming the Federation. Basically, they send a cube in attempting to assimilate Earth, Starfleet destroys it, and then the Federation massively innovates to create even better technology. The Borg then come in and assimilate the new tech, rinse, repeat. When you look at the face of it, it makes some sense. It would certainly explain why the Borg only send one Borg cube in at a time, and why they don't just go all in to win this war. Some would theorize that since the Borg don't know how to research, that they would allow the Federation to do the work for them. Putting aside that we see the Borg innovate and research before that damnable Voyager episode that says they don't, the inability to do research seems like a major flaw for an entity that wants to become perfect and bring unity to the galaxy. But that's another conversation for another video. So as I was saying, the theory that the Borg send in ships to make the Federation freak out and create a better technology is interesting, but faulty. If it were true, what's being done with the Federation is never observed with other species. You can't tell me there aren't other species like the Federation they could be doing this to in the Delta Quadrant. Now, you could say that we don't see the whole of the Borg, and that's fair enough, but by that logic, we also don't see the Borg Queen riding a unicorn as she conquers Middle-earth only to be stopped by Gowron. In theory, farming technology could be something that is done to sufficiently advance enough species until they reach a specific point that the Borg feel that they might become a threat. I think this is folly, and the Borg would notice it, as it does give the species a chance to evolve to a point they can defeat the Borg. But again, it's possible. Another hole in the series is when you consider time travel in First Contact. The Borg utilized time travel to go back in time and assimilate Earth, changing the whole of history. The only counter to this is basically a paradox. So you're telling me the Borg go back in time knowing the Enterprise E will follow them. So again, they go back in time so that they are followed, are defeated by the Enterprise crew to have a few of the Borg survive. The Enterprise E returns with the time travel technology, giving Starfleet the ability to travel through time with no issue. And the Borg now know this because the Borg that survive send a message to the Cube in the past that the Enterprise D hasn't met yet, letting them know that the Federation exists, and they will have time travel technology even though they don't have it right now, and so you need to go forward and pretend to assimilate them even though you haven't, because you need First Contact to happen in order for them to get time travel technology, which we know the Borg do gain time travel technology in a Voyager episode. I mean, it's so simple and definitely not convoluted. Ultimately, as stated, I don't think the Borg farming theory holds weight. I additionally think we had a missed opportunity with Hugh and his Borg. But those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. The First Contact encounter with the Collective is probably the most stunning visualization that we see of the Borg, and definitely the most terrifying. Unfortunately, I do feel the story elements of the Borg here bring them down to below the story writing standards of Best of Both Worlds, but it's still a good piece of lore and a great movie. It's interesting to look at the Battle of Sector 001. We learn a lot more about both the Borg and Starfleet technology. At the Battle of Wolf 359, Starfleet was absolutely no threat to the Borg. Starfleet ships were tossed aside and destroyed like they were nothing. We see a significant change during the Battle of Sector 001, however. During the battle, we see that Starfleet weaponry is very effective against the Borg, causing extreme damage to the Borg cube itself. This is not to say that the Collective is not still superior. Indeed, the cube is able to break through at least one, if not 2 to 3, blockades made by Starfleet. However, the Federation has had time to prepare for just this encounter. We know that Starfleet has increased their weapon capabilities by dialogue found in Best of Both Worlds, as well as dialogue found in the Voyager episode Dreadnought, which did air and occur in continuity before the events of the Battle of Sector 001. In the Voyager episode, it is stated that there has been significant increases in torpedo technology. Additionally, we know that during this time, the Federation has been building up for their confrontation with the Dominion. When the Dominion is first encountered, their ships easily bypass the shielding of both space stations and Galaxy-class starships. However, by the time of the Dominion War, the weapons and defenses have been upgraded to at least be able to withstand an initial attack by the Dominion themselves. Another example can be seen in the DS9 episode Paradise Lost. Again, this episode occurs before the Battle of Sector 001 and includes an Excelsior-class ship that is significantly upgraded with advanced weapons and defenses. So we see that Starfleet is now, at least at this juncture, able to upgrade its ships and weapons to a point where they cause significant damage to Borg ships, at least in large numbers. In later episodes of Voyager, we also find out that an Intrepid-class vessel is the match of a Borg sphere. So while taking all of that into account and looking at the battle, the Borg cube is ultimately heavily damaged and a Borg sphere is launched to escape the impending destruction. Here's a thought. A lot of people assume that the use of the sphere was Plan A, that they wanted to get close enough to Earth to launch and then assimilate Earth in the past. Some theorize that it was a backup plan, that it was just in case the first failed, just a run-of-the-mill Plan B. However, what if instead of just normal operations, it was a desperate ploy by the Borg? After realizing that Starfleet had been able to gain significantly in technology, far more than they thought, it was decided to attempt to assimilate Earth in the past in order to stop this level of technology from being gained. Another explanation, which is far more plausible in my opinion, is that the Borg did this to complete the loop that they were in and ensure that the Borg would ultimately find the Federation. The attack on Sector 001 was never to actually assimilate Earth nor the Enterprise. They needed to send a signal back to the Collective in the past to begin making its way to Earth in the Alpha Quadrant. This would explain them stopping at Deck 11 on Enterprise E. Now, in theory, you could argue that this would be accomplished by assimilating the entirety of the Enterprise E. However, it is possible that the Borg are aware, at some level at least, of the future Starfleet-like entity that monitors time, as well as Q, and thus are very selective when they use time travel and how far they'll go once in the past, doing this to prevent any type of temporal war they would not be able to win against entities far superior than they are. Honestly, I don't feel that this explanation is airtight. It does leave some lingering questions, but it is a possibility. It would appear to explain how the Borg were sloppy in their assimilation of the Enterprise. However, regardless of what the real reasoning is, the battle for the Enterprise E would occur. During this battle, the crew of the Enterprise E are largely assimilated and utilized to attack and either kill or assimilate their fellow crewmates. Though I'll be honest, the battle for the Enterprise E can be pretty lackluster. Ultimately, the Borg would assimilate from engineering up to Deck 11 and stop. They would utilize the technology to begin an attempt to sabotage that of first contact with the Vulcans and contact the Borg in the Alpha Quadrant. Even though I describe this as a battle, the Borg interactions are consistent with what we've seen in the past. The drones do not attack unless they perceive an imminent threat or need a use for those that are present. The largest addition to the lore would be that of the Queen. I've spoken of her before, but this would be where she had her debut. Based on the information we gather, the Queen has always existed as a part of the collective as far as humanity is concerned, including being on the Borg cube at the Battle of Wolf 359. The entire dialogue of the Queen is so abstract that you can really make it out to be whatever you want it to be. She never really answers a question in a way that has anything substantive. From what we see in First Contact, it would appear that she has some presence on every ship, or at least the cubes. There are a lot of discussions and theories on whether she controls the Borg or is just a part of the collective to some degree. In the Star Trek Voyager series, we see her have substantial power over the Borg. There are even interactions with her and the Borg as a collective where they're about to do an action and she countermands it. Again, whether this is due to her being a different processor working in tandem or a controlling hierarch in some form is unknown. To be fair, there are a lot of beta canon resources, including what we see on Star Trek Online and novels and film shorts. Now these are interesting theories, and I would love for Star Trek canon to pick one of them up and go with it. If they will is a different story, of course. But looking at the battle for the Enterprise E itself, the Borg would ultimately fail and the Enterprise E would return back to their timeline with advanced information on the Borg and Borg technology. I'll discuss the implications of that in a future video, but ultimately First Contact added a lot of visual deadliness to the Borg and opened up some interesting conspiracy theories, but failed to really deliver on anything substantial for lore of the Borg. It honestly added more questions than it answered, but those are my thoughts. What are yours? My main problem with the Borg in the Star Trek Enterprise Regeneration episode is that it felt like they tried to really shoehorn the collective in. I get why execs would want to, but unfortunately, as with any prequels, when you try to explain something happening before it logically could or would happen, you have issues. The premise of the Borg being on Earth at this time is pretty simple. The debris from the Borg sphere landed on Earth after it was destroyed by the Enterprise E. I honestly have a few issues with this. From what we know of Picard, he has always been very meticulous about preserving the timeline. We specifically see him giving orders for his crew to stay out of history's way in the very movie that the sphere is destroyed. Additionally, in yesterday's Enterprise, Picard is not willing to give advanced technology to the Enterprise C. In a timeline where Starfleet is losing a war and it is a bleak outcome for the Federation. It seems baffling to me that Picard would not attempt to recover or destroy all of the Borg sphere. The sensors of the Enterprise still work. We see this when the Queen attempts to destroy the Phoenix. There's no reason why they shouldn't be able to detect and either recover or destroy the vessel. However, for whatever reason, Picard would fail to ensure that all of the Borg components are removed and Borg technology would survive into the events of Star Trek Enterprise. I've already talked about this in a video, but it does bring up some pretty stout questions, including why was the wreckage site forgotten by Starfleet? If it wasn't forgotten, then what happened to all of the technology? Beyond just the Borg drones present, there was a ton of metal alloys and computer components left over, all from the 24th century. We know via dialogue that a lot of this analysis was sent back to Starfleet Command. However, even with this advantage, we see no indication that this tech was utilized or even improved upon. Some have tried to theorize that the Borg destroyed the wreckage, but we have no real indication of that. They appeared to just want to get the hell out of Dodge. It's possible that Section 31 was able to recover the wreckage and keep the advanced technology to themselves. As I've stated before, I talked about this in another video, and it would explain how Section 31 seems to be ahead of even Starfleet. But that's still convenient to me. And yes, before anyone talks about Section 31, they were a part of the original United Earth Starfleet. They didn't come after. Rewatched the series. Another issue that I just find funny would be that the scientists attempted to carbon date the metal and successfully determined that the metal was over 100 years old. The problem is, carbon dating is specific to organic materials and related to Earth specifically in the way we use it. Thus, the materials would have had to be made of some kind of organic material, and then that material would have had to consume animals on Earth at some point. So unless the Borg started scooping up animals from Earth in the 24th century, created the sphere with it, then crash landed that sphere back on Earth, there's no way the scientists could have utilized carbon dating specifically to determine how old the ship was. Honestly, it's probably no wonder that these people were assigned to the Antarctic to take care of this hellhole mission. Another problem would be that a lot of the data was sent back to Starfleet. They specifically say that they sent some of it already back to Starfleet. This again could be explained by Section 31, or perhaps the data being over 100 years old by the time of the events of Q-Who, it's somehow forgotten, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. The main issue I have with the episode is that it's dealing with the Borg. This means in order for the Borg to be there and to make sense, they have to choose between it making sense within the series or making sense within the franchise. They chose the series. I honestly don't mind the actions of Archer and think the crew of the NX-01 Enterprise make reasonable decisions and assumptions. It's just that we're dealing with the Borg specifically where continuity problems come in. Had they been dealing with another organism like the Borg, everything would have been fine. I honestly think it's a good episode. On that topic, in the episode, the scientists that think you can use carbon dating on things that weren't present on Earth are assimilated and their ship is additionally captured. The NX-01 Enterprise is dispatched to save the crew and hijinks are abound. Ultimately, the Borg do act similar to how they're seen in Best of Both Worlds and First Contact, with only a few minor issues. Namely, the Borg assimilation process is much slower than what is generally seen in other episodes and movies. Well, it's generally slower. SF Debris breaks down why the assimilation process might be so slow in his review of the episode, but there are some plausible theories. The most reasonable is that the Borg were isolated and frozen for over 100 years. The fact that they had to regenerate themselves into life would mean that they're probably weakened and their ability to assimilate is thus impacted. Though this is highly inconsistent. Sometimes they can assimilate quickly, sometimes not so much. Honestly, the most interesting part of this entire episode is the assimilation of the United Earth vessel. Every time we see it, it has enhanced systems, including additions such as weapons and the warp engines. These systems are constantly being upgraded, even pushed to what the United Earth thinks is possible. Additionally, a theory that I discussed in earlier episodes is that most Borg vessels originally started out as assimilated ships. This episode seems to suggest that that theory has some merit. Every time this vessel is seen again, it becomes more modular, moving into a specific shape. It's possible that the ship would have become a sphere or even a Borg cube had it been allowed to continue. Ultimately, the crew of the NX-01 Enterprise would defeat, i.e. destroy, the Borg vessel. The Borg on the ship would be able to send a signal giving the location of Earth before this occurs, however. Again, I've discussed this in previous episodes, but it does tie into the theory that the Borg did all of this on purpose. In order to ensure that the Borg are aware of the Federation and start moving to where Earth is to encounter the Enterprise D, they attack Sector 001, fail in that attack, go back in time, allow the Enterprise to destroy the sphere, which ensures that the Borg will then be able to send a message back to themselves in the past. Some have tried to theorize that this event creates a new timeline, and thus everything we see isn't prime, and utilize some flimsy arguments. Which is ironic because in other videos, they'll say that they shouldn't add to what's not in canon to discuss our points when we're having a debate. It's really quite simple. What's shown on screen is the prime timeline. The events that occur before or after ensure that the timeline we encounter is prime. Yes, dear Timmy, the Enterprise D and the Enterprise E exist in the exact same prime timeline. The Borg sending the message in regeneration doesn't change the timeline because they always would send it in the prime timeline. In those events, the Borg were already on their way towards Earth because they were alerted and always would be alerted. Again, time travel has been inconsistent at best on track, but this is clearly what is portrayed on screen. But as always, feel free to argue with me and headcanon whatever you prefer. The last piece of the discussion is the lack of knowledge the Federation and Starfleet appear to have on the Borg, at least when they first quote-unquote meet a Borg cube. This is further complicated with the series Voyager that has scientists with a small child following a Borg cube. While the explanation for this is sketchy, the best one I think I've found that fits together is that the Borg were considered a one-off experience that occurred only to the United Earth, and wasn't something that most other species had to deal with. You then add the experiences of other species like the Binar that will remove parts of the brain and put in technology in small babies, and it's something that wouldn't be on the forefront of everyone's mind. While it would be in the periphery, with even scientists theorizing about the Borg, perhaps even some crazies going off with their children as we discussed, they probably didn't take it seriously. And then you would have the events of Q-Who. The United Earth and Starfleet realized that they were aware of this species for over 100 years and have done nothing to defend against them. It's possible, if not likely, that Starfleet would classify this information and only allow those who were working on fighting them to know directly about the attack that occurred in the past. This would explain why Picard had no idea who they were, why they were so unprepared, and how they didn't know how to counteract what the Borg were doing. And it is also possible that there were already attempts to counteract the nanotechnology, but given how ill-prepared the ships were, they wouldn't be able to use it because everyone else would be killed due to the fact that the ships could not defend against a Borg cube. Given the amount of outrage the populace would have if it was ever known that Starfleet knew about this before the war, this would explain why we have our cover-up. Like anything else, this doesn't answer all of the questions, but it's an interesting thought. I don't know. What are your ideas? Let me know in the comments below. In this discussion, there will be three elements involving the war. Three integral parts. You have the Borg Collective, Species 8472, and Starfleet in the form of USS Voyager. I won't be breaking down the play-by-play of the Voyager episodes Scorpion 1 and 2. Though no worries, I intend to come back and open up that jar of pickles at some point. For now though, if you want to see a bit of a synopsis of that entire ordeal, I have an older video you can click in the top right hand corner or look at it in the description below. It's a bit of an older video and I intend to redo it at some point, but it's a good primer. Ultimately, the Borg Species 8472 war began with a Borg incursion into what is deemed fluidic space. The Borg had become aware of Species 8472 and additionally had found a way to penetrate their space. The Borg, deciding they were Starfleet for a moment, swarmed fluidic space like they owned the place. And again, showing that they have more in common with Starfleet than either side really realize, they got the living hell beat out of them. The Borg Collective was pushed all the way back into the Delta Quadrant. While the Borg may have started the war, Species 8472 was determined to end it. The Collective was being utterly destroyed. Borg weapons weren't wholly ineffective, being able to disable or destroy a Species 8472 ship with enough time, but ultimately the Collective was outmatched. This does raise a question though. I make jokes and I do find the Borg to be egotistical, but they have never come across as just utterly stupid. When the Borg first encounter the Enterprise D, they investigate it, scan it, try to understand it first. They look at its technology. However, when dealing with a species they know a fraction about and consider that species to be some form of evolutionary perfection, they just try to zerg it? Depending on which Borg mythos you want to go with, the Borg either study the problem themselves or assimilate species to study anything that they don't understand. An outright attack against a species they clearly had very little idea of doesn't seem to fit their MO. And I get it, some say they simply didn't understand the magnitude of the species they were attacking. Which is fair enough, but remember that they considered this species to be perfect. It seems like they wouldn't underestimate them to the degree that we see they do. Either way, underestimate them they would. There have been some interesting theories that this war is what precipitated both the events of First Contact and Regeneration. That with the war with Species 8472, the assimilation of the Alpha Quadrant and Earth would be vital to winning that war. It would make sense that only one Borg cube would be sent, the rest focused on trying to slow down Species 8472. However, I find it unlikely. If they truly need to assimilate the Alpha Quadrant, it would make more sense to send at least 2 or 3 cubes. While this would be a loss of ships to the Collective during the war, it certainly wouldn't be substantial. Additionally, the gain in cubes and personnel would more than make up for it. Either way, back to the Delta Quadrant, it would appear this would be the end for the Borg, if not for Starfleet to the rescue. While the Borg Species 8472 war was raging, the USS Discovery entered the edges of Borg space. However, they identified a swath of territory in Borg space that had no Borg activity, and went all the way through the Borg Collective space. Being scientists with a mission to ask the question why and explore, they of course wouldn't inquire, even internally, as to why the Borg wouldn't be in this area of space. Thinking things through is for the weak after all. While making an approach to the passageway, 15 Borg cubes would come out of transwarp and completely bypass them. This, of course, would confuse the Voyager crew. At this point, they should all be Borg. Finding this interesting, they would begin to explore and finally ask questions, and would come across these same cubes utterly destroyed and identify an alien ship. Alright, now for all of those of you who believe that Janeway was right in interfering and siding with the Borg, I want you to consider this very first interaction. Species 8472 is minding their own business, and then all of a sudden their space is invaded by this hostile species. Species 8472 pushes them back and then invades the space of that species in a counterattack. In one of these battles, a Species 8472 scout is looking into a Borg cube for whatever purpose. All of a sudden, another starship of unidentified origin shows up, a ship by the name of USS Voyager. This ship doesn't attack the Borg, doesn't keep going about its own business. No, it stops and begins scanning. They beam aboard the Borg vessel that Species 8472 is on. What do they do from there? Do they begin salvaging Borg tech or killing Borg? No, in fact, they leave the Borg alone. They even lower their weapons when they see a Borg drone. This new, possible threat even begins to download information from a Borg node, showing a knowledge of the Borg and possible kinship. At the same time, soldiers board the vessel of Species 8472. They take scans from the inside to gain knowledge of the ship and get information. When these soldiers see a Borg drone that has been killed or is being hurt, they retreat. So again, put yourself in their mind space. You're fighting the Borg Collective, a Starfleet ship shows up and by all appearances seems to either be neutral or helping the Borg. Additionally, they're more interested in gaining information on you than your enemy. What's that look like to you? And then these soldiers leave your ship, and of course you attack them because why the hell wouldn't you? This is all hostile actions. You're at war, and it appears that these people are allies. And then when we look at what happens next, Voyager attempts to get the hell out of Dodge, and what does Species 8472 do? They power their weapons, sure, fire once and miss, and then get a direct hit. A direct hit. And while damaging Voyager, do not destroy it. These ships eat Borg cubes for lunch. Every piece of dialogue and everything in this episode says that a Species 8472 ship is far more advanced than that of Voyager and the Borg. And you're telling me that Voyager could survive a direct shot. It makes more sense that Species 8472 wasn't sure who this new contender was and just wanted to scare them off, which would make sense if you're at war with one species and wanted to destroy that species and then just be about your business. Scare off anyone else who wants to get in the middle of something they have no business being in the middle of. But then, if we looked at all of this and took it in context, you'd have to admit that Janeway and her crew did something wrong. And God knows we can't do that, which is probably why the person who disagrees with me watches Discovery, isn't it, Snowflake? Okay, picking unnecessary fights aside, there's no connection there, I was just making a joke. This seriously makes no sense if you assume 8472 wanted to destroy the entire galaxy. From everything I can see in the battle itself, Species 8472 didn't know the intent of Voyager, saw that they seemed to ignore the Borg and only focus on the ships of 8472. So 8472 acted overtly hostile, angry, and gave a stern warning shot. Kes states that the pilot was trying to get a hold of her. She states that the pilot says that the weak will perish. If Species 8472 was trying to scare them off, this is exactly what you would do. If you are in an argument with another person and a dog comes up and starts trying to sniff around or trying to figure out what's going on, what do? Do you just ignore it? What if it starts getting into your stuff? Do you try to talk with it and explain the intricacies of why it shouldn't get involved, or do you tell it to go away, scare it off? If you're trying to scare it off, wouldn't you use verbal and physical cues to ensure it goes away? I know it's insulting, but Voyager is so less advanced than both the Borg and Species 8472, this is something they might consider reasonable. The next time we see Species 8472, surprise, surprise, they are in the corridor Voyager wants to use due to a lack of Borg. Again, we have Kes who is sensing them telepathically, and she feels there is malevolence, coldness from all of these aliens. She can sense that they are an invasion force. Again, context. Look at what's happening here. Let me ask you this. If a telepathic species had entered into orbit above the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they had seen all of the humans on the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Do you think they would have sensed love coming from the Americans, Canadians, British, and other troops storming those beaches? Do you think those people were apathetic when they raced up the beaches themselves? By that time in World War II, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, if not tens of millions of people were dead. If I had to bet, a telepathic race that arrived above Earth orbit on D-Day would feel nothing but hatred, would feel fear, would feel cold. And they would feel a need to destroy everything that was on that beach that wasn't them from both sides. Remember, Species 8472 was isolated. They only knew what came through their space. Maybe, at that time, they did want to destroy everything, but it's likely that they only thought of the Borg in that equation. Certainly, future Voyager episodes, including Hope and Fear and In the Flesh, indicate that Species 8472 is willing to talk, and only initially wanted to destroy everything when they were looking at the Borg. And then let's look at a final piece. Species 8472 had been investigating a Borg cube, or whatever the hell they were doing on it, and the USS Voyager showed up. And then the next time Species 8472 sees Voyager, they find the ship in concert with a Borg cube. Both of these ships flying in formation towards an unknown destination, but clearly working together. But yeah, Species 8472, they're the bad guys. You know, I don't even know why I'm trying. Those who disagree have already commented, thumb down, and kept it moving, not even watching at this point. I'm just preaching to the choir, so let's just keep it moving. Unfortunately, there is not a ton of information when it comes to the war between the Borg and Species 8472. Understandably, the focus is on the USS Voyager. What we do know is that dozens, if not hundreds of worlds would fall to Species 8472, with hundreds of millions of drones being killed. In fact, in one instance alone, the Borg lost 312 Borg ships and 8 planets, totaling up to 4 million drones. Voyager would ultimately help the Borg develop a weapon that would be able to destroy Species 8472. After the weapon was successful, the ships would be in full retreat. Now, it is at this point there is some confusion. We can't tell via the dialogue if the technology to defeat Species 8472 was transferred to the Borg. This would leave the Borg without the ability to make the nanoprobes immediately, and would explain why the collective didn't attempt an all-out attack on Species 8472. Additionally, Species 8472 didn't attack back because they didn't know the Borg didn't have this technology. So both sides were at a stalemate, not realizing that the other side didn't have an advantage. At the end of the day, this would show the Borg in a way we had never seen them before. Desperate. We could now understand that the Borg could be negotiated with, as was stated in The Best of Both Worlds. The Borg Collective, once thought to be a juggernaut that could not be talked to, was just like anyone else when they were about to be exterminated. But those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. When looking at the Voyager episode Drone, it's hard to not instantly see how much it doesn't make a lot of sense. Luckily, the series you're watching right now is based on Borg lore, so I won't be going much into the episode itself. Long story short, the Doctor's mobile emitter becomes infected with 7 of 9's nanoprobes when an issue with the transporter briefly merges everyone being transported. Of course, these nanoprobes didn't get into the systems of anyone else, and they aren't assimilated, but let's just gloss over that for right now. As stated, the mobile emitter would become infected and assimilated. Unfortunately, the crew of Voyager would not know when something is being assimilated or what it would look like. You know, having all the knowledge from the Battle of Wolf 359, having a Borg on their ship, and even being in Borg space for a small amount of time. This means that they wouldn't have any idea what was going on when looking at a tech that has Borg nanites in it. So without even realizing it, they would leave the mobile emitter alone and have the computer scan it to try to determine the damage that has occurred due to the transporter accident. And lo and behold, the emitter would begin assimilating the computer station it's on. Now here's a question. We know the mobile emitter assimilates this specific station to make a maturation unit, but why did it stop there? The station is hooked into the computer and attached to Voyager, so why not continue assimilation of the entire ship? Why did it stop? I mean, if I wanted to, I could try to theorize that this entire episode was based around giving birth and letting a child grow up and learn who it is. Perhaps the nanites were a part of 7 of 9 and realized that she secretly and subconsciously wants to now have a child. Thus, they create a maturation chamber and birth a new Borg. Perhaps this entire episode is an allegory on how it's okay for women to want to become mothers and how the life of a child inside of you is precious. Or it's just bad writing. I mean either or. In any case, create a maturation chamber it does, and 7 of 9 would be alerted to the presence of another Borg. She moves to alert Chakotay and the bridge, deciding that this information is so important, so vital, she's just going to walk to the bridge versus utilizing her comm badge. Chakotay, of course realizing they are still near Borg space, relatively at least, given transwarp, and that a Borg presence presents a massive threat to the ship, checks that the scanners haven't picked up any Borg and tells them to double those scans, then sends 7 of 9 to medbay like she's having a tummy ache. Look, I get that it's very possible that 7 is having issues with her implants, but the Borg are a really big deal. This is red alert territory until they can be absolutely sure that nothing is going on. It would be better to be at red alert and be wrong than to be caught off guard by a Borg cube. Additionally, I know that their security measures would alert them of intrusion, but they aren't even going to run an internal scan just to be sure. We know that Borg tech will randomly activate and start assimilating things, this episode being a prime example. So why not just run an internal check to be sure? The fact this crew gets home, even with Admiral Insaneway erasing children from the timeline to make it happen, is proof a God exists, and that he hates all of us. So while the crew don't seem to really take the possible incursion of the Borg all that seriously, a Borg incursion occurs. An engineer walks into the science lab and checks on the mobile emitter to find that part of it has been transformed into some form of Borg alcove. He would instantly contact the bridge. He would contact security. He would grab a phaser and fire on it. He would do some fucking thing to save the ship instead of the dumbest action possible. He'd pull out a tricorder and begin scanning the extreme threat to the ship without alerting anyone. While scanning it, tubules would come out and attack the engineer. Unfortunately, he wouldn't be killed, which is exactly what this guy deserves. The Borg tech would take his DNA and begin making a baby. Which finally leads us up to the entire point of this episode. With the DNA, the Borg begin a cloning process, again creating a baby. 7 of 9 would comment that this is not what Borg generally do. They don't create people, they don't have babies. Now, some people have tried to say that this is a retcon or a mistake, stating that in earlier episodes it does show the Borg have maturation chambers. However, I do feel like this can be pretty easily explained. It's likely that the babies found on the Borg cube in the encounter with the Enterprise D were from a culture that had been assimilated by the Borg, that they didn't begin some cloning process until sometime in the future, as this suggests. This would mean that 7 of 9 is correct, that this form of technology, this way of creating clones, isn't how the Borg operates. It would suggest that perhaps cloning technology hasn't been perfected enough at this time. This is also assuming that this Borg is what the current collective will become. Given our knowledge of how evolution works within governments and ecosystems, it's honestly near impossible to ever really predict how the Borg will progress or how any species will progress. It's more likely than not that the Borg of the future will not resemble anything like this Borg, given all the integers that are present that forces change. Moving on though, the option to kill the Borg as a baby is presented and ultimately denied. Interestingly, Janeway refers to the baby as a whom, a person. She also states she doesn't want to kill or murder the child. Honestly, I think this is worthy of a conversation at a different time, but I do think this shows some intriguing ideals. But again, that's a conversation for another time. There is a vital piece of information that I think is generally glossed over when people watch this episode. The advanced Borg will eventually become ready to be integrated into the collective, but has not yet received commands. This means that the Borg, after the maturation process, have the ability to be individuals, to become whatever they want to be. Think on that a moment. This process isn't wholly unknown to the Borg. 7 of 9 recognizes it, which means that babies that are assimilated probably go through a similar result, just sans the cloning. The implication is that the collective has the ability to have a generation of Borg drones that are born and become independent. This opens up a possibility that the Borg collective could one day stop being a quote-unquote collective and ultimately turn into a government, a nation of people, one that might be apt to discuss and barter with other governments. It's honestly not as far-fetched as you might think. The Borg collective expands, assimilates, and evolves as necessary. We see them make drastic changes from the best of both worlds to this episode. Who's to say that they wouldn't attempt the cloning process in order to save themselves? In fact, let's say perhaps after a virus is uploaded that destroyed most of the collective due to a reckless admiral and captain who are the same person. And with the collective so hurt, the uplink to the new drones is damaged and you start having individuality brought back into the fold. Just a thought. After information would be uploaded to the drone, it would begin to have its own individuality as we've discussed, and generally allowed to do whatever it wants. I mean, we do see security follow it around, but ultimately the drone is allowed to walk around, look hostile towards other people, including Neelix, and access panels. Additionally, most security personnel only have hand phasers versus the powerful rifles they could use. They really didn't take the drone all that seriously when you break it down. The drone would ultimately, inadvertently, contact the collective, and of course the Borg would dispatch a ship to investigate. A Borg sphere would arrive and attempt to capture Voyager. Curiously, there is a piece here that will be important at a later episode. We see the drone improve the shielding and weaponry of Voyager. This has been used as an argument in future episodes, and it's something worth noting. The Intrepid-class vessel has now been enhanced as far as the limitations of its technology will allow. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be powerful enough to defeat the sphere. The drone would beam over to the sphere itself and co-opt the controls of the Borg, destroying it. Again, something that I think we need to consider. The Borg directly interfaces with the collective. What's amazing is that he is able to resist the call of the Borg, which again makes me wonder, could the Borg become so advanced that they can not be forced to listen? That could be an interesting evolution into the Borg themselves when you think about it. After destroying the sphere, the Borg would basically commit suicide so that the collective wouldn't chase him, even though the collective has no way of knowing he was dead. And additionally, Voyager would not strip him for parts and utilize what they gained from the technology to defeat future Borg, or get home. I mean, it'd not be sporting after all to use advanced Borg technology against the Borg. I know that I stated in the past I would only be talking about the Borg Collective and its history in this breakdown. However, I feel that this episode and discussion was necessary. The Borg drone would improve the Intrepid class and add what the Borg could be, which is to say, they could be free in the future. But those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. We'll be starting this conversation out with, well, quite a bit of controversy, as I've stated. That is to say, the discussion will revolve around a Borg probe versus that of an Intrepid-class vessel. Before we get into the battle proper, it behooves me to point out that the Borg and the probe act extremely odd compared to previous interactions we see with them. We know from Best of Both Worlds that the Borg act as one mind, and yet we have a singular Borg here walking along and hitting a ton of buttons to see the Intrepid on a screen, which isn't consistent with how they operate. Again, just peculiar. Previously, in a Starship lore breakdown of a Borg probe, I'll include it in the top right now, I specifically stated that an Intrepid-class ship was the match of a probe itself. This is largely due to dialogue in this specific episode, Dark Frontier. However, when rewatching the battle in this episode, which again shows the Borg to be largely ineffective, I do take note that during the battle, Janeway specifically states that we can match your firepower. Not, this vessel can match your firepower. And the Borg never note that the firepower can be matched because it's an Intrepid-class vessel. Now, many sources, including Memory Alpha a while back, took this to mean that an Intrepid could take on a Borg probe. Again, it was something that I believed as well, so I'm not putting down those resources. But rewatching the battle after doing my review of Drone, it's as likely, if not more likely, that the upgrades done by the 29th century Borg and other sources is probably why Voyager was now on an even playing field with this Borg vessel. Additionally, it would explain why the Borg probe engaged in the first place, believing that the Intrepid-class vessel would be easily overwhelmed. And generally, we've never seen Borg technology be overcome by that of the Federation. The Federation is more powerful in this era, true, and can do actual damage by this point. We see this at the Battle of Sector 001, but to win one-on-one is still unheard of. Again, I guess you could argue that's why the probes are never sent, but it seems to make more sense that the enhancements of Voyager would be why the Intrepid-class vessel won. Not that it was an Intrepid-class, or that the Intrepid-class is on par with a probe. But I'm really curious. Let me know what your thoughts are. As I said, this is a Borg lore series, so I won't be reviewing the actual episode. I mean, who would call something a Borg lore series that basically just reviews episodes with the Borg in it? That's not actually a Borg lore series, it's just reviewing episodes that have the Borg. So, doesn't make a lot of sense. But even though this is focusing on the Borg Collective, I will take a moment to point out how inept the Voyager crew are. In the scenes after the fight with the probe, the Voyager crew is analyzing Borg technology, and this Borg technology still can run around, and some of it can still assimilate things. None of it is in cryo. None of it is in isolation so it can't get out. So the Voyager crew are just continuing to be top notch. Just way to go. However, the actual breakdown for the video starts when the Borg Queen contacts Seven. The collective is able to access her neural transceiver and their minds become one. Interestingly, the Queen states that she knows what Seven knows and is aware of the incoming attack on the Borg sphere. This would also mean that she probably now has the information about the nanites that could defeat Species 8472. Though, this is after the peace agreement and the information on the nanites being shared with Species 8472 by Janeway, which probably makes the nanites at this point useless. You know, off topic, it's interesting that Species 8472 wanted to destroy all life, and now they couldn't be stopped. Again, they've probably found a counter to these nanites. However, they decide still not to invade. Back to the episode at hand, the Queen advises that she is aware of the attack, as I've stated, and offers to let Voyager go if Seven gives herself up. Curiously, even with this offer, Seven continues to go along with Voyager's plan. She doesn't warn them. You think she would advise them and let them know so that they could counter this, or at least not even do the plan so no one gets hurt, but whatever. The crew discusses hiding from the Borg by utilizing a biodampener, which had been created by Seven's parents. I've discussed the Voyager crew using this outdated technology in the past, the fact that the Borg are aware of it, and honestly, there were some interesting theories brought up in the comments about these devices. We know that once assimilated, all of the knowledge of the individual becomes the knowledge of the collective. The collective would naturally know about the dampeners, which makes its usage sketchy at best. But a more interesting piece of this topic is the discussion on the Borg utilizing the dampeners themselves. In Best of Both Worlds, we know that the Enterprise D could not detect any individual Borg. Hell, for most of the TNG series, this stays true. What if the Borg assimilated the biodampener and utilized it on their ships? This would then bring everything more into a cohesive understanding. Starfleet would ultimately figure out how to bypass the technology, but it does seem like something the Borg would do to hide their numbers. What do you guys think? Ultimately, Voyager would enact its plan to steal a transwarp coil and do this by attempting to bait the Borg with a shuttle. The thought is to entice the collective to capture the shuttle to assimilate it. This would require the Borg to lower their shields. Again, we see an inefficiency where the Borg are looking at consoles, but ultimately they take the bait. I might be wrong, but this seems like the first time we hear the Borg having shields, at least in Voyager. Again, I think I might be wrong in that, but it is at least most important for the Voyager series in this episode. You see, this is a substantial change because the Borg didn't generally utilize shields. When first encountered, they utilized subspace fields that were much more powerful. Shields can ultimately be beaten down. The fields would adapt and make any other attempts at an attack useless. Now, if I were to theorize why this happened, I would say that it's probably due to the war with Species 8472. The subspace fields would be unable to adapt, and the Borg began utilizing shields, which gave a modicum of protection. Just a thought. Once captured, the interaction between the Borg Queen and 7 of 9 is very telling of the collective at this point. The Queen, while observing 7, states that 7 has been quote-unquote remade in the image of humanity, that she's been disassembled and given back things such as her hair. She then states that 7 is still hers. There's two things to this. First, that the Borg believe that the natural state is to be Borg. That in and of itself is something very interesting, something I'd love to delve more into. The other piece is that this dialogue is crazy frustrating, because on the face of it, it would seem to prove that the collective has a leader, and that leader is the Queen. But many will try to say that the collective is simply talking through an avatar, except we only ever see them talk as one cohesive unit. Until Locutus, of course, at which point they did have a single entity. Then 7 of 9 was to be similar to Locutus, and now we have the Queen. The problem is the Queen has always been there, even before Locutus, as we see in First Contact. So why wasn't she always utilized as an avatar? Why did the Borg think Locutus, or even 7, were worthy when she could have done the job? The Queen honestly seems to be able to effectively communicate with humans, and if you think her safety was a concern, why do you think in such three-dimensional ways? They say that Locutus and 7 of 9 are needed to understand humanity, but again, the Queen seems to do this just fine. The fact that they utilize Locutus and 7 of 9 doesn't appear to do them any favors either. It's just that the Queen causes more problems than she solves, which is to say she solves no problems at all. I am really not the hugest fan of her introduction, if I'm being honest. I will say one thing about Dark Frontier though. It does clear up a huge plot hole that a lot of people have brought up. In the Next generation, we know that the Borg will go to any length to recover their own. So why didn't they come after Seven? The answer is found when it's discovered that she was allowed to be captured. The Borg knew they would still be able to catch up to Voyager, so allowing her to stay with Voyager to gain information on humanity and regain her own individualism might have been something they decided to do that it would be worthwhile. With Seven's experiences, the Collective, or more likely the Queen, chooses not to make her a drone now that she is back, though she is modified to make her more efficient. The Collective, or again the Queen, wish for her to stay an individual so that they can better assimilate Earth, stating that she was the only Borg to ever regain her individuality. So basically, 7 of 9 would become the messiah of the Borg, at least for Earth. Like Locutus, but way more attractive to most people. As a part of this long game that the Borg Collective is playing, 7 of 9 is taken to the assimilation of another species. During this time, the species is able to utilize their phasers to bypass the Borg's shields. The Queen asks 7 of 9 what they need to do or their ships will be destroyed. 7 of 9 is resistant at first, but then gives a tech answer. The Queen's response? I was thinking the same thing. Think about that. I was thinking the same thing. Not we, not the Collective, not the Borg. I. Again, this is frustrating because more and more the Queen appears to be some autonomous entity within the Borg, but then there are times when she is not. It's just simply not true. Regardless, ultimately the tech change is successful and they are able to conquer the species. During the assimilation process, Seven encounters individuals of the species while they are being assimilated. I'll take a moment to say this. The music is not conducive to the mood, but the screams of the people as they are being assimilated and seeing docile beings walking with the Borg for final assimilation is very scary. It's filmed very well and would have had a major impact if not for some better choices, again with the music. After the assimilation of most of the species, Seven would be indignant that over 300,000 people were assimilated. She would be countered by the Queen, who states that Seven can feel their distinctiveness being added to the Borg, that this species wasn't just 300,000 anymore, but their essence, everything that was good in them, was now being added to billions upon billions. Look, I'm not justifying the Borg, nor am I a fan of what they do, but there is a certain quality to that this species, is now known across the Delta Quadrant, and they have made the lives of far more than they can count better. When Seven speaks of the species' individuality being stripped, the Queen points out that there is no we or me anymore. There is only quote-unquote us. One mind, one voice. Which is counter to earlier parts of the episode with the Queen using I, but whatever. During the conversation, the Queen realizes that 4 life forms on a beaten ship have been able to escape. She asks if the Borg Collective should assimilate the ship or if it should be destroyed. Seven suggests that they let them go. Of course, this is after her having been the person to help them escape in the first place, and telling them how they could escape. Seven argues that it would be inefficient to either stop the ship or to destroy it. And after all, it's only 4 individuals. The Queen argues that if the ship is allowed to escape, the species would continue to resist them. This type of paranoia is kind of interesting to me. It's also counter to everything we see in TNG. The Borg don't assimilate everything in sight because they fear reprisal. They do it to make everyone's life better. This doesn't make a lot of sense. The only reasonable reason to give this type of response here would be to somehow trick or confuse Seven, but to what purpose? Why would the Queen lie here? The Queen moves to assimilate them and Seven begs for their lives. Seven even uses the word please. The Queen allows the species to survive and Seven looks shocked, stating that the Borg never had compassion. The Queen just walks off. That's something that we're going to have to delve into a little deeper in the next episode. Ultimately, the story of Dark Frontier isn't uninteresting. It's extremely intriguing. I just hate that they decided to utilize the Borg. I think it might have been better if perhaps instead of the Borg, they made it an offshoot of the Borg or another species altogether. Perhaps making the season about this powerful species that was similar to the Borg but never seen until this episode. And then you have Seven being captured. I mean, I'm not sure, but it just doesn't feel like the Borg act appropriately here. But what are your thoughts? Did it gut the Borg or add to their mythos? Let me know in the comments below. In the last video, I discussed how Seven is captured by the Borg Queen and the Queen's duality when interacting with the Voyager crewmen. I also discuss how the dialogue of the Queen doesn't make a ton of sense. Sometimes she seems to be an individual, sometimes she's a part of the collective. We left off the last video with the Queen stating that she feared reprisal from a species, that's why she was going to assimilate or destroy them. Stating that when that was never the goal of the collective never feared reprisal. And then she would show compassion by letting some survivors go. This was intriguing because compassion is something that we've never seen in the Borg before. When she's called out on it by Seven, the Queen never actually addresses it. And of course, it's going to be forgotten for the rest of the episode. After this, the next interaction we see is a discussion between Seven of Nine and the Queen. The Queen needs assistance for a new type of assimilation against a highly resistant species. At first, the dialogue makes you think that it is specific to physiological resistance, that the nanoprobes just can't assimilate the species. Which, by the by, nanoprobes are interchangeably called nanoprobes and nanites depending on the episode and series you're watching. I know some people have had an issue with that, but again, they use both terminologies. When asked to change the technology so that it can assimilate other species, Seven notes that it's changed so much that she wouldn't recognize it. This honestly is great continuity when you consider the technology of the Borg would be changing and upgrading at a near hourly rate. Every assimilation would mean a possible change to all technologies involved. However, the Queen wants Seven for her innate knowledge about the first target of this new type of assimilation. The Queen intends to assimilate species 5618. Humans. Confusingly, the Borg Queen describes humanity with an inefficient physiology, below average cranial capacity, minimal redundant systems, and limited regenerative abilities. But it is warp capable. My question, if humans are so inadequate, why are you assimilating them? I mean, it only makes sense if you want to bring cohesion and perfection to the universe, but it doesn't sound like humanity, as far as the Queen is aware, will make the collective any better. Additionally, the Borg collective is extremely short-sighted here in my opinion. The Federation is more than just humanity. While Earth falling would be a massive blow, after two different Borg assaults and the Dominion War either occurring at this time or about to occur, you would think the United Federation of Planets would have redundant worlds that are able to take up the mantle if Earth would fall. Which means that assimilating Earth would be devastating, but not destroy the Federation at this point. I also question why the Borg don't consider a different strategy of hitting other targets rather than Earth specifically. This all would make sense that they hyper-focus on Earth if the collective was a computer, which they may be, but the dialogue and portrayal doesn't make it appear to be so. The Queen also states that their assaults on the Federation failed, as I've noted. And I'm just gonna say this, you should probably consider sending more than one cube. But regardless of these issues, the Queen advises Seven she will need to assist in making a biogenic weapon that will disperse into the atmosphere and will take years to assimilate the planet. This weapon is so insidious that half of the population would become drones before they could even react. I'm also going to question this methodology. They have assimilated Starfleet personnel by this time, we know that, so they have to be aware of the advanced medical capabilities of the Federation. It's not unlikely that the Federation would figure out what they're trying to do. Though to be fair, Starfleet can't tell between Vulcan ancestry and Romulan ancestry, even though today I can pay $100 and see my bloodline back to Africa, so maybe the Queen's onto something there. Seven points out that this weapon is inefficient, and the Queen states that they have waited this long to assimilate Earth, so what's a few more years? She's not wrong, but this is a shift from taking what you want to having patience. Again, the argument between Seven and the Queen is pretty interesting into how the collective operates. Seven states that she won't help destroy humanity, that she is an individual. The Queen points out that she sounds like an automaton, just talking points. The Queen isn't exactly wrong here either. Seven of Nine is telling the Queen what Janeway and the crew have told her. And honestly, from the perspective of the collective, it makes no sense to want to be separate and imperfect when you can share your knowledge and make the galaxy better. Both sides think the other is just spouting propaganda with no value added. Huh. And then, we have yet more evidence the Queen is somehow different. The Queen tries to talk Seven into assisting in this process and states, quote unquote, "We all originated from lesser species. I myself came from species 125, but that's irrelevant now. We are Borg." Unfortunately, this sentence shows that the Queen has some level of self-awareness. She isn't Borg, not one cohesive unit. She is a part of the Borg. If I was assuming that the objective was to keep the Borg static, then I would probably throw this to poor word choice. A better way to phrase this dialogue might be, every life form within the collective originated from a lesser species. This vessel itself, the one you're talking to, came from species 125, but that's irrelevant now. We are Borg. But honestly, I'm starting to have doubts that this was ever the intent of what the writers were doing. I don't know that the Queen was meant to be a part of the collective. But I guess I could just sit here and drone on about all of these inconsistencies, but let's just assume, for now, that they meant it in a way of my rephrasing. Ultimately, Seven would continue to argue with the Queen, stating that she will not help assimilate humanity. Seven tells the Queen that she should just go ahead and assimilate her, and the Queen honestly calls her bluff. Once Seven shows that she does fear assimilation at this point, the Queen summons Seven's father. Well, the Borg drone of him at least, and with his help forces her into the alcove. Though before Seven can begin assisting the Queen, it is discovered that Janeway is using multi-adaptive shielding to try to save Seven. Voyager, in an attempt to save Seven of Nine, is utilizing the technology of her father to hide from the Borg. Janeway tries to contact Seven through her implant and was discovered by the Queen, as I noted. The Queen then utilized the information from the Borgified father of Seven of Nine to adapt and see the shuttle. Here's a question. Why didn't the Borg immediately adapt after assimilating the Hansons? The technology was something that the Borg had never seen before. It's the fracking reason they followed and assimilated the Hansons in the first place. And if the Borg still couldn't see through it, why didn't the shielding block the Borg cube when it went back online on the Hanson ship? Remember, the shielding of the Raven was off just shy of 14 seconds. And because of that, the Borg chased them to the ends of the galaxy. But if the Borg hadn't adapted yet, when the shields came back online, the ship should have been invisible. Borg idiocy aside, the Queen does ensure the adaptations can be seen, and now the shuttle is intercepted. Janeway modulates the shields, which somehow helps. Again, why did the Hansons not remodulate their You know what? Fuck it. While the collective still chases Janeway, the Queen lies to Seven. Again, I'm not sure to what purpose. Perhaps it's to ensure Seven doesn't try to escape, but lying feels like it's far off from perfection. Janeway and her away team beam onto the Borg vessel with biodampeners. You remember those things, the same devices worn by the crew in Part 1 when the Borg could see them, but now apparently they can't, but could before. Finally, the Queen is able to find the shuttle again. However, it remodulates and goes invisible. The Borg begin to fire blindly into space to find the shuttle, and ultimately they do. They capture it with a beam, and the Queen advises Seven that she was a failure, that she was not going to be the asset that the Queen hoped that she would be. During what I assume is about to be the assimilation of Seven, Janeway comes in to save the day. She tells the Queen that she should stand down or Janeway will destroy her. The Queen tells Janeway that her weapon won't kill her. She asks Janeway why she thinks in three-dimensional ways. She assimilates Seven, and after being hit, the Borg assimilate Janeway, and she returns. She stands down like it actually matters if she's hit with the fucking weapon, and even seems scared that the shuttle will fire on her location, even though the shuttle is caught and everyone on it should be assimilated at this point. The Queen then points out that they would all die together, and Janeway responds, better dead than Borg. The Queen, seeing Janeway isn't lying, orders the Borg to release the tractor beam, though for some reason won't let them beam out, because this all is making a ton of sense right now. Janeway orders Seven to disable the field, because if there's anything that says individuality, it's listening to the command of a person and following them because you have to. The Queen gives her point of view to Seven, saying that it's only one voice, one command, insignificant compared to the Borg, which apparently have a Queen that only has one voice and gives commands, but let's just go past that. Seven, deciding whose side she's going to be on, tells Janeway to fire on a piece of Borg tech and then smugly tells the Queen, our minds are one, indicating Janeway and Seven minds are one as they beam out. Now, as my tone probably infers, that entire sequence is completely stupid, but I'm going to pause a moment because there's something we need to discuss. When Janeway destroys the interface, it disrupts the Queen's commands. To quote Seven, it will disrupt her command interface. As I continue the breakdown of the Borg, I realize more and more the Queen is not a part of the collective, but the head of it. There are just far too many inconsistencies for it to be a continuity issue. I'm not going to be delving into this in this breakdown, but don't worry, we're going to come back to it. There have been comments that the Queen is a virus, or perhaps some species that found a way to fight back. I'd love to know your thoughts, because it seems clear to me now that this is probably the case. The Queen is the head, and the Borg are her subjects. But give me your thoughts. Back at the topic at hand, while I stated I'm not going to be doing a breakdown of the episode Dark Frontier, I do want to note the ending. From what we can tell, the standoff between the Queen, Janeway, and Seven happened on what we know to be the Queen's ship. That ship began chase of the shuttle that Janeway and Seven were on, and was ultimately destroyed when Chakotay fired on it. Remember, Seven's parents, or at least her father, was on that ship. Chakotay killed her father. The Queen did specifically point out that the Borg never killed her parents. They made them perfect. The Borg saved her parents versus killing them. Something we never see Voyager do. Food for thought. As stated, I think that a deep dive into the episode and part of the Borg lore has turned me around on the Queen. I sincerely don't believe she is now a part of the collective like we thought before. She's some form of leader at some level. But those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. As I've stated previously, this is not a breakdown of individual episodes that involve the Borg, but an intricate breakdown on the Borg collective and its lore. It's ironic that in the Voyager episode Collective, we learn more about the collective in what they don't do versus what they do. In this episode, spoilers for those who haven't seen it by the by, a Borg cube runs across a pathogen that specifically destroys and kills cybernetic life forms, which is highly specific. Imagine if a species were to infect someone and then send that person to the Borg. I mean, that would be insanely effective, but nah, no one would ever think to do that. Just insane. Anyway, back to the breakdown at hand, the pathogen just devastates the Borg cube and all the Borg drones on it. Well, all except the drones that are in the maturation unit. Because, as anyone knows, babies in the womb have extra protection biologically, so it only makes sense that we have the exact same cliche wherein a maturation chamber defends the life of the baby just like a mother's womb would. Because what's the point of doing this entire thing if you can't do it like every other science fiction show? Snark aside, this does present some very specific and interesting details on how the Borg deal with children and adolescents from other cultures. The dialogue between Seven and the children seems to indicate that any individual who has not reached adulthood is put into a maturation chamber. As that drone grows, their Borg implant grows with them. This means that the cybernetic components are not added all at the same time, but are kind of grown with the person depending on that person's age. Additionally, these Borg are conditioned, the collective bringing order to their minds throughout the years like some form of brainwashing. It really is an interesting addition to the Borg lore. However, what is more frustrating than interesting is the way the collective handles the derelict cube. In the episode, the Borg collective deems that the drones are irrelevant and the Borg cube not worth salvaging. Now let's pause a minute here. The dialogue is extremely clear for those who want to argue that the cube was to be destroyed. Seven states specifically that normally when Borg are determined to be irrelevant, they deactivate. They don't destroy themselves, they don't self-destruct, they just flip a switch and go offline. In previous videos, many have argued that the Borg collect their dead to prevent the technology from getting into the wrong hands. However, this seems to be an extreme shift from what we've seen historically. As I've stated in the past, the Borg were all one unit, one organism. They no more would lose a drone than lose a finger. But now, they are willing to just toss drones aside as if they were nothing. Some have theorized that this change occurred due to Hugh, that once he was reassimilated and caused discord within the Borg cube, if not the collective, that a policy of simply disconnecting drones was adopted. Now this is possible, sure. But you'd have to convince me that a human would be okay with chopping off an arm that may or may not have gangrene. No guarantee if it does or not, but they're just going to chop it off. I suppose we can assume that the Borg go the route of better safe than sorry. There is some logic to it, but it's somewhat of a stretch. But even with that in mind, you're telling me that the collective are now so scared of what happened with Hugh that they would leave a Borg cube whole. We have no reason to believe that the Borg cube doesn't still have all of the major technologies that the Borg utilize. Subspace adaptation fields, Borg armor, transwarp, advanced weaponry, and information on the collective in its entirety. The Borg collective are so scared that they will get infected, they won't at least find a way to blow that thing to hell and back? Man, thank God for the collective that the crew of Voyager are so stupid that Voyager doesn't find a way to steal all the technology from the cube. You know, like a transwarp drive, that thing that nearly got some of Voyager's crew killed when they were attacking a sphere, but is just here for the taking on the cube. And before anyone says it, I know that the vessel was damaged. I get that, but we have no reason to believe that the components couldn't be reused, fixed, or just weren't operational because you had only children running the ship. And don't even get me started on how the collective now decides not to bring unity to the galaxy like they've always wanted to do, but worry about quote-unquote perfection and if something is going to hurt them becoming the ultimate species. Honestly, there isn't much more to add when it comes to the collective lore from this episode. However, since people accuse me of only pointing out errors without offering fixes, let's take a stab at it. Now, I'm going to assume that it's the Borg that has to be encountered. Additionally, we have to have kids, and it has to be a pathogen, as we know this ties into the next episode. So here's what I would have done. Instead of a Borg cube being found, I would have had Voyager trying to make its way home, as it always is, and all of a sudden they receive an emergency SOS. This SOS would have been from a ship that is currently being assimilated and is requesting help. Sensor shows that no other Borg vessels are in the area, and after some debate, it's determined that they will try to save the crew and gain any Borg tech that they can. Given the upgrades that we've discussed that have been done to the Intrepid vessel, the partially assimilated ship is no match for Voyager. Voyager disables the ship quite handily, and they beam aboard to find all of the completely assimilated adult individuals dead. There are children aboard, only half assimilated, but now knocked out. They determined that the Borg adults were killed by some form of pathogen, but for some reason, the children also have that pathogen in them, but it's not impacting them as quickly. The children are secured and put into stasis aboard Voyager, under guard of course, and while an away team is trying to get the Borg tech, the children awaken, they barely hear the Borg collective's call, and they try to resist. They overpower the guards and beam back aboard the other ship off of Voyager. And then, these children Borg send an SOS to the collective. Sensors show a Borg cube is 30 minutes away, and thanks to Tech, Voyager is able to hide and isn't identified by the collective yet. The away team is captured by the Borg children, and now we have a ticking time bomb dilemma, and the children now have captured people, so we're off to the races. In the end, the crew save the kids, destroy the ship without being able to get any of the tech, and get the hell out of Dodge before the Borg are able to identify that Voyager was ever there. And then in the end, you tie the fact that the pathogen was going so slow because it had been put in there by scientists in the next episode. And that would be my fix. Ultimately, this episode collective fundamentally changes how the Borg operate when it comes to errant drones. While this is most likely a lack of concern for the continuity issues it presents, the shift in treatment of drones can be explained by the Hugh phenomenon. Quick side note, in this breakdown I will be analyzing obvious inconsistencies with the Queen and her interactions with the Borg collective. However, right now I won't be going too deeply into that discussion. Due to these drastic changes, we have to assume that there has been some shift within the collective itself, or nothing's going to make sense. So for the moment, we're going to assume that this isn't any kind of continuity issue or bad writing, but something massive that has changed within the Borg. We'll get down to the writing and continuity issues at a different time. Getting to the episode proper, when analyzing the Borg collective in the Voyager episode Unimatrix Zero, it's very engaging and eye-opening to see this aspect of the Borg. And if I'm going to be honest, it's something that I never considered, but I think makes a lot of sense once watching the episode again. Namely, that mutations could occur within the collective and impact the drones specifically. When you think of the Borg, they are indeed their own type of culture that ultimately becomes some type of organism. However, all of these species that are brought together would be augmented and likely genetically changed. If bringing both perfection and order to the galaxy is important to the Borg, then changing any deficiencies in a species would make sense. It also explains why the skin of every species assimilated ultimately turns white to one range or another. With these changes, it would be logical then that some unforeseen mutation would occur. One of these mutations would be the creation of Unimatrix Zero, a construct that allows individuality for Borg drones when they are in their regeneration cycle. Though, here's a fun fact, this episode aired nearly a year after the Matrix movie launched and was a massive success. We can't be sure how long the Unimatrix Zero construct existed, however dialogue indicates that it was probably around for at least a few decades. This is derived from multiple sources, but the main one being that Seven of Nine was a part of it for a lot of her life. And we have reason to believe that the construct existed before she even joined it. After all this time though, for one reason or another, the collective ultimately became aware of the existence of Unimatrix Zero. As we all know, the Borg absolutely do not investigate, research, or use the scientific method to fix problems. They only assimilate. So of course, it's no surprise when we see them in this episode start investigating, researching, and utilizing the scientific method in an attempt to figure out how to stop people from joining Unimatrix Zero. As I've already discussed, the interactions we see with the Borg seem to delineate heavily between the Queen herself and the Borg Collective. In almost every interaction, she uses words such as I and you. Now, I'll grant she utilizes we sometimes, but that only makes it confusing as she doesn't use it a lot and it seems really hit or miss. And she is very big on seeming like an individual when interacting with other Borg. As an example, in the first scene we see her, the Queen is discussing the quote-unquote sickness that has impacted one of the Borg drones, allowing him to have individuality in Unimatrix Zero. The Borg drone doesn't respond to her specifically, so the Queen removes him from the collective. Note, she states that she has disconnected him from the collective. Now, some might say that she's just being the avatar of the collective, but still, it's odd. She states, "You're alone. I know how uncomfortable that can be." This all seems specific to an individual. She then gives orders to other drones. Think about that as well. Again, many will state that the Queen is some avatar, and yet she has to tell these drones what to do? It's just curious that this entire interaction occurs. After the scene, we see the Borg definitely not continuing to do research to try to find those who can access Unimatrix Zero. The mutation itself is something that's really interesting that was added. I do like it as a storytelling instrument. Occurring only in 1 in every 1 million drones, it is apparently also extremely difficult for the collective to determine what drone is infected. We are never given why this is, but it does make some sense. First, the mutation is stated to be recessive, which can be harder to find. And 2, given the vast territories of the collective and how many drones that exist, it may be hard to diagnose each individually. Additionally, the drones have no idea they have this ability when they awaken, and so the collective is not made aware with their thoughts. I do have one question though. While it is consistently stated that the Borg drones within Unimatrix 01 have no way of impacting the outside world, they are somehow able to contact 7 of 9. This is of course explained due to her Borg implants. However, if they can contact 7, why not drones who wake up after being in Unimatrix Zero who are still a part of the collective? You'd have to be careful. True, you wouldn't want the collective to know about you, but would it be possible to somehow fashion a virus or something and send it to a drone that is awake within the collective? That way you can hide yourself and not put Voyager in danger. Presumably, they all have similar implants to that of 7. Now, in theory, this might have been discussed and dismissed as any attempt to contact a connected Borg might have been too great a risk, but it would have been nice to at least see them discuss it in the episode. Looking at Unimatrix Zero, we'll get into its breakdown after this. When analyzing what drones have the mutation, we see Klingons, Hirogen, and even officers who state they were assimilated at the Battle of Wolf 359. Which, how, honestly? The only explanation that I can think of is that one of the ships survived the Battle of Wolf 359. Though this is tenuous, we do know that one ship did survive that battle, but we don't know anything about the ship itself. It's possible that it wasn't destroyed, it was assimilated and then sent back to the Delta Quadrant. Why the Borg would do this and not assimilate all of the ships, I don't know, but it's the best explanation we got. Also, just as an aside, for those who want to try to point it out, there's no evidence that the Klingons ever joined the Battle of Wolf 359. And in fact, the official Star Trek website states that they didn't. We have no more reason to believe that the Klingons were there than we do that the Breen decided to get into the party. We know that the Klingons and the Romulans were possibly invited to fight the Borg, but none of them made it in time. That aside, back to Inconsistencies Central, the collective continues to investigate the mutation. We get even more odd dialogue from the Queen. While talking to a dead Borg, she states, "It's a shame you aren't alive for the disembodiment. It's the epitome of perfection." So, do the Borg not feel what she feels? Are they not all one hive mind? Or is this just her own personal pleasure? If the collective isn't aware of what disembodiment is like, if they aren't connected to the Queen in that way, why? Additionally, while trying to figure out how to stop the signal that keeps Unimatrix Zero running, she says, "You are making this very difficult," and she seems frustrated, while the rest of the Borg seem like zombies. As I've alluded to, ultimately the free drones within Unimatrix Zero reach out to 7 of 9 to convince her and the crew to help them keep Unimatrix Zero hidden. Those on Voyager ultimately agree to help, and it is discussed how to introduce nanites into the Borg collective to hide the drones. When it is questioned how they would get this to the entire collective, 7 of 9 notes that the central plexus within the Borg cube is connected to the entire collective. Now let's pause right here. Many have claimed that Hugh in Borg only impacted one cube. I even talked about how that may have been a possibility. However, this directly contradicts that argument. If every Borg cube or vessel has a central plexus, then this would mean that everything is shared. This is also an amazing weakness for the Borg. Any species that realizes a nexus exists could, in theory, upload a virus through that means and defeat the Borg. Just something to think about. The last piece of this video I want to discuss is how the collective contacts Voyager. Through transwarp tech, the collective accesses the computer core of Voyager and discusses the situation with Janeway through comms. The Queen offers to get them home early if Janeway stays out of this quote-unquote civil war. So let me get this straight. The Borg have the ability to utilize transwarp to access the computer core of Voyager and to talk to Janeway, but can't disable the ship to assimilate it. Let's assume that they can only talk to them, can't do anything else. Why the hell wouldn't the collective just access the comm and play Klingon opera at ear-destroying levels? This ability is severely underused by the collective and shows how Voyager defeats them so easily. And while I was tempted to take swipes at the Borg for negotiating, this is actually not outside of the bounds of what we see with them doing. Even in TNG, there was discussion that the Borg may be open to negotiation. We just have never seen it because of how inferior Starfleet was. When analyzing the beginning of the quote-unquote Borg Civil War, it's curious to see how inefficient the collective is. They literally kill thousands of drones to take down one or two. While you could make the argument that there are millions to spare, if you ask me, such inefficiencies are far from perfection. While I've stated that I won't discuss the episode itself, but more just the Borg's interactions in it, there is a piece of Unimatrix Zero Part 2 that fascinates me. Specifically in the episode, when Janeway, Tuvok, and B'Elanna are assimilated, they somehow keep their individuality. So you're telling me that after assimilation, the Borg simply wouldn't notice that these new drones haven't been added to their own? Now, some might argue that it's a ploy, that the Queen clearly is aware of them but was trying to hide the fact. But we know that isn't true because they're using a suppressant that allows them to stay unnoticed. And it's only after the suppressant begins to wear off with Tuvok that the Queen is able to notice them and even states, "I heard the Vulcan. Why can't I hear all of them?" It is possible that, given assimilation probably occurs every minute of every day, the collective simply wouldn't notice 3 voices. But these aren't exactly random NPCs from the planet Hoth. Janeway, a woman that has thwarted the collective and specifically the Queen quite a few times, has been captured, and then after assimilation they just don't notice that her and her crewmen can't be heard? They don't see that at all? Additionally, we know that the Queen can identify when a single voice on a cube has gone silent, so when she heard Tuvok, how did she not exactly find the cube that Tuvok was on? And if she already knew, why didn't she send other Borg after them? You're telling me the Borg don't know how to search for rogue Borg on their own ships. But regardless, go unnoticed they would until the collective overwhelmed Tuvok, but not before Janeway was able to get the virus that allows the freed drones in Unimatrix Zero to stay individuals when they wake up from the regeneration cycle. Let's talk about that for a moment. When I was challenged about the central plexus and it transmitting to the entire collective, many theorized that there are firewalls or perhaps a mini collective that everything is tested at first. While this is possible, there is no dialogue or reason to believe that it's true in any of the episodes. Unfortunately, like many things, we may just never know. Back to the analysis, Tuvok ultimately succumbs to the collective and betrays his friends, as I've noted. Another interesting point here though, the Queen specifically thanks Tuvok once Janeway is captured. She thanks him. However, even with the capture of Janeway, the virus ensures that all of the Borg that were a part of Unimatrix Zero are freed. This would be unfortunately for one of the freed Borg too, since he was right next to the Queen when it happened. But we'll get back to that in a second. The Queen wanted to talk to Janeway and thus had the Borg force the captain into an alcove to have her image transmitted to where the Queen is located. Before the image got there, the Queen modified the transmission so Janeway's image didn't look like a Borg drone, but herself. Again, this seems extremely inefficient to me. Every time the Borg interacted with the crew of Voyager, they tried to assimilate or utilize technology that would make the discussion easier. Why didn't they do this with Janeway? Janeway already has Borg implants, so why not just connect her directly? Janeway is using a suppressant to keep her freedom true, but just neutralize it, and then Borgify her. This would make her thoughts the thoughts of the Queen. How is that not any more efficient than what she actually does here? However, it may be that all of this is for the benefit of Janeway, though I still don't understand why we care about what Janeway wants. The Queen even states how vain Janeway is, thus utilizing her image. Maybe she's doing this as an attempt to get Janeway to capitulate of her own free will, because that has always worked out every time they've tried to get a human to capitulate of their own free will. Looking at this continued manipulation, the Queen shows Janeway the freed Borg that I had discussed before and that she had killed. In the dialogue, the Queen stated that she had to, because of what Janeway did. The Queen demands an antidote, and Janeway states that they didn't make one. The Queen threatens to assimilate Voyager to get to the Doctor, and like we've seen before, Janeway states that she had given orders to delete the Doctor before assimilation could occur. It's interesting, this is the second or third time that Janeway has given orders to delete the Doctor. It's not exactly a new trick. You would think that the Queen, or the Collective, would have come up with a plan to counteract this tactic. But counter it they wouldn't, so we would see Janeway and the Queen swap barbs, which, again, why? The Queen is being drastically inefficient here. Assimilate Janeway and then have her pretend to not be assimilated to get the jump on Voyager. But instead of using my incredibly thought out idea, the Queen would have to endure Janeway relishing in the fact that a lot of damage will be done to the Collective. Now, for all of the issues I have with this episode and its impact on Borg lore, there is a pretty good play by the Queen here. She agrees with Janeway that the Collective will have a tremendous amount of damage, and so she decides to show Janeway the damage it will do. She starts exploding vessels on ships where as little as one voice has gone quiet that she can't find, on a vessel that has tens of thousands. Now, this would be good for a regular Starfleet officer, and we'll get back to that in a minute, but ultimately, even with this play being impactful to someone who cares about life, it's ridiculous. Again, I've discussed it, but she can't identify which Borg are not a part of the Collective. Are the Borg like Cylons, where they can't see or harm other Borg? Does the Queen personally have to identify them? When you think about it, and you watch the episode, it's only when the Queen sees the Borg that they realize that this isn't one with the Collective. The other Borg don't seem to notice. So if she can't individually look at them, the Borg are screwed. So instead of doing the arduous process of linking into another Borg drone and finding them, she just starts blowing ships to hell. Now again, I don't like this writing when it comes to the Borg, but I do like the manipulation tactics of the Queen. With most Starfleet officers, this would have an impact. She begins killing Borg by tens of thousands in front of Janeway, and all because of what Janeway did, pointing out that these deaths are on Janeway's hands. You can even see the pain on Janeway's face. It's really well done, really well acted. Of course, ultimately, she is dealing with Insaneway, so she should know that even though she's appealing to the Starfleet officer within Janeway, which is just a fraction of a percent that exists in her still, killing people by the thousands? Janeway will go back in time and change the entire timeline of the Alpha, Delta, Gamma, and Beta quadrants. Ultimately, the Queen is a noob when it comes to destroying people's lives. But Janeway lore aside, we see that the Queen is her own person. Janeway challenges the Queen to go to Unimatrix Zero. And when there is hesitation, Janeway asks if the Queen is afraid that she'll get a taste of individuality. Here's the thing. If the Queen is just an avatar of the Collective and she goes, isn't the Collective going as well? So technically none of this is logical because any Borg drone of the Collective would see the same thing when that Borg drone is sent to kill the freed drones. So visit Unimatrix Zero the Queen would and ultimately come back unimpressed. As I stated in the last episode, the Borg cannot investigate, research, and come up with conclusions on their own, so naturally, they retrofit the nanovirus that freed all the Borg to make it so it would kill them. Because why the hell should they or we care about continuity at this point? So with that out of the way, the Queen attempts to negotiate with Janeway, telling her to go in and convince the drones to return to the Collective before they are killed. And to be honest, there is some continuity here. It seems like the Queen and the Collective care about these drones. When you think about it, it was only one drone in a million or some such like that, so you're not losing that many in the long run. But she's willing to go out of her way, even negotiate with an inferior species to get the drones back. It's a nice little piece of continuity given that the rest of this episode didn't care. Janeway pretends like she's agreeing with the Queen and contacts Voyager to disrupt and destroy Unimatrix Zero. She uses double entendre to ensure that Unimatrix Zero is destroyed, but allows the Borg to stay freed. Chakotay understands the order that was given, and with Unimatrix Zero destroyed, ultimately Voyager would be joined by a sphere that has been taken over by Borg rebels. Of course, they wouldn't get any Borg technology, because why the hell would they? But Voyager and the Borg sphere attack the tactical cube to get their people back. I ultimately have mixed feelings about this attack. A tactical cube can take down a Borg sphere, no question. However, I do think that now that we have similar tech, it's more even and it would take some time to destroy the sphere. Additionally, Voyager is updated with advanced tech, including from the 31st century, so this might be more of an even fight than people let on. So the fact that Voyager and the Sphere are able to destroy or at least weaken the cube doesn't surprise me. The Queen would move to destroy the cube, and thanks to the help of B'Elanna, Voyager would be able to get all of their crew back. The Sphere and Voyager would part ways for Voyager to begin its trek on home. The only other piece here I don't like, and it's not connected to the collective specifically, is the recovery rate of B'Elanna, Janeway, and Tuvok. While Tuvok would take a couple of weeks, Janeway and B'Elanna seem to be fixed almost instantly. When we look at what happened to other people, including Seven of Nine, Jean-Luc Picard, and even others in Voyager, it takes a long time. What occurred to them is a dramatic thing. It's not something that I think that you can get over in just a couple of hours or with a cup of tea. But, of course, this is Voyager, and that's what they do. Before I get into the last episode, we see the Borg, as of the upload of this video at least. I'm going to front load my complaints by pointing out that all of the inconsistencies we see in the episode before this one, and indeed in most of Voyager, continues with this episode as well. The Borg Queen acts very individualistic, in fact, even taunting Seven by saying that Seven was her favorite, that she was there to see an old friend. She even says Voyager was left alone because of Seven of Nine, which, for those who continually state the Queen is an avatar of the collective, you're telling me the entire collective has a favorite Borg? The entire collective. Wouldn't that negate the Borg being a collective to have favorite individuals? Anyway, this consistent inconsistency is all throughout the episode, and I don't intend to be a broken record, so I'm just pointing it out here. When analyzing the Borg at this stage, it's hard to tell what abilities they now do and do not have. As an example, in this episode, specifically Voyager's in-game Part 1 and 2, Admiral Janeway travels back in time in order to save roughly 200 or less people, wiping out entire generations in the process. When she arrives, the entire interaction and the communications between Admiral Janeway and Voyager are observed by the Borg Queen. We can't be exactly sure how, but it's likely one of two reasons. First, it could be the case that Borg sensors are so powerful they are able to observe the event involving Voyager from so far away. Or, the Borg enhancements completed on Voyager allow the collective to tap into certain subsystems without the crew of Voyager being aware. This seems the most likely and would explain both this episode and Voyager's episode Unimatrix Zero. It also explains how the Borg Queen could override the regeneration node and nearly kill Seven. Anyway, regardless of how the Queen does it, the Borg Queen does contact Seven through her alcove after seeing Admiral Janeway arrive and advises Seven that the collective will assimilate Voyager if they attempt to re-enter the nebula that the Admiral wants them to. While initially this is a good deterrent, the psychopath pretending to be an Admiral convinces Captain Janeway and her crew to enter into the nebula. However, luckily for Voyager, the Admiral's new armor makes it so the Borg weapons and assimilation attempts are ineffective. This presents a problem for the Borg because in the past, as we know, they aren't able to identify an issue, determine the problem, research that problem, and find a solution. So with this new obstacle regarding Voyager, the Borg start identifying the issue, determining the problem, and researching ways to find a solution. As Borg cubes begin scanning the Intrepid-class vessel to figure this out, Voyager attacks them with transphasic torpedoes, utterly annihilating the vessels. Interestingly, when the Borg are unable to assimilate and destroy Voyager, and Voyager shows to be a substantial threat, the Queen orders that the Borg back off. This is actually very consistent with Borg tactics. If they can't beat something, they pull back. It's odd and feels wrong on screen, given that the Borg always have been a powerhouse, but they would not instantly fight something they couldn't understand or couldn't beat. Now, for those who want to point out the war with 8472, the Borg really only got serious, really only started going balls to the wall when they didn't have a choice. As stated, most of the lore really comes between the interactions of the Queen and Admiral Janeway. Admiral Janeway is utilizing technology from the future to speak inside the mind of the Queen, being able to have a discussion without physically being there. Ultimately, Admiral Janeway has asked the Queen to get Voyager home by force. Admiral Janeway stating that her counterpart, Captain Janeway, is refusing to get her people home because Captain Janeway wants to destroy the Borg. It's a long story, you really need to watch the episode to understand. Ultimately, the Queen does offer to get Voyager home, by force if necessary, if the Admiral gives up her ship and all its technology. Oh yeah, future Janeway came back with advanced technology to the nines, and that is something, of course, the Borg would want. Admiral Janeway agrees that she will ultimately give all of the tech after Voyager is forced to return to the Alpha Quadrant. However, the Queen reveals that they already found the ship of the Good Admiral, so that won't be necessary. The Borg Collective, of course, captures the ship and the Admiral, who is then assimilated. This is where a lot of the controversy about if the Borg still exist today or were completely annihilated come from. The Queen was infected with a virus by assimilating Janeway that begins to utterly obliterate most of the Borg that we see. The question is, did this happen to the entire collective? And the truth is, we don't know. There is evidence to show that there was catastrophic damage done to the Borg. However, to what extent remains a mystery, as evidence supports both their being destroyed and their survival. The evidence of them being destroyed is fairly obvious. You see the Queen literally fall apart, the destruction of at least one transwarp gate, and the annihilation of Unimatrix Zero. However, Admiral Janeway states that she has done just enough to bring chaos to order. She specifically says, just enough. We also see at least one Borg ship, the Sphere, appear to still be in operation. It could be argued that there is a delay for the pathogen to reach all of the collective, and that's fair enough, but then that would give the Borg the ability to counter and shut off some of the collective to protect itself. And if we're being honest, that isn't consistent with what's said in previous episodes with the central plexus, which was stated to instantly spread something to all of the Borg collective. If I had to guess, given what I know of Trek and the Trek universe and the phrasing that was utilized, this was probably a crippling blow to the Borg, but not fatal. It is likely that a substantial part of the Borg network is destroyed, but they aren't gone completely. As of the upload of this video at least, the Picard series could change all of that. Ironically, this specific episode doesn't add a ton of lore, as you're noticing. I don't really have a lot to work with here. It's telling to me that the series ending episodes don't help at all. Even after seeing the Borg in one movie and 3 different series, an understanding of how the collective operates and indeed their overall goal is still somewhat a mystery. We do know that originally the Borg were non-cybernetic beings that continued to augment themselves until they became the Borg Collective. While we don't know when these life forms officially became cybernetic zombies of doom, it is clear that the Borg were a regional power in the Delta Quadrant during the 15th and 16th centuries, as they had assimilated only a few systems. They continued to expand and in the 22nd century became a dominant presence in the Delta Quadrant. There isn't a lot of information on the Borg in the 23rd century either, unfortunately, except they either destroyed or assimilated, or both, the El-Orians. El-Orian survivors would spread across the galaxy, ultimately making it to the Alpha Quadrant and Starfleet, who would then officially become aware of the presence of the Borg. Interestingly, what was considered new and frightening in the Alpha Quadrant was commonplace in the Delta Quadrant by the 24th century. The Borg would have become the central power of the quadrant itself. It would be at this time that we know the collective began to take an interest in the Alpha Quadrant, utilizing their transwarp technology to investigate at least the United Federation of Planets, Romulan Star Empire, and Klingon Empire, though it's likely they spread further than just these 3. During the events of the TNG episode Q Who, we're not really sure how the collective deals with other species. There is evidence that suggests the Borg initially only care about technology. They would capture entire colonies and ships with little regard to the organics. However, it's possible that this perception could be due to the limited knowledge at the time of Starfleet. Assimilation might have been common practice at the time, and we really wouldn't know. It just depends on which series you want to believe. Regardless, all this leads to the primer of the Borg Queen. While the Queen herself has many theories on who she is and what she stands for, it's very hard to definitively say which is accurate in canon. Her dialogue in First Contact is annoyingly vague, and she doesn't do much better in Voyager until she becomes the ultimate Bond villain. What we can say, without delving into theory, is that the Queen has been a representative of the Borg and included as early as the Battle of Sector 001, though she would claim that she's existed for far longer. She has been, at the very least, a mouthpiece for the Borg and would appear to work as some form of processor in one way or the other for the collective. She also appears to work both as the collective and an individual on behalf of the collective, depending on the interaction needed with other specific species. And that's about it. So with all that out of the way, let's get into some of the theories that could make sense but aren't exactly canon. Before I go too far into this, it's very important to remember that some of these theories assume that the Queen was lying and somehow manipulated both the Borg and Picard, which honestly isn't out of the realm of possibility. We know that Picard can still be influenced by the Borg, so with that in mind, let's take a look. The first theory to discuss is that Hugh's independence spurred the creation of the Borg Queen. Again, this would require deception on the Queen's part, but it's not insane. We know that when Hugh was returned to the Borg that there was mass chaos. I stated in a previous video that it really could be linked to just the Borg cube, but we know that every cube has a central plexus that is connected to all of the collective. Now, it is possible that this nexus is somewhat shielded, but we don't really have enough evidence one way or the other. So if it did spread past the cube and you had the Borg near annihilation, the creation of the Borg Queen to bring order back to chaos makes sense. We could even have the collective lying to itself, saying that it's still one entity when it is clearly not. This would explain the extreme differences that we see in TNG all the way to Voyager. Another theory is that this was some form of resistance from a specific race. We know that the Queen apparently has either a preference or requirement to be a specific species. This can be garnered by just looking at the Queen models, noticing that they all have similar characteristics. It's possible that the assimilation of a certain race of females overwhelmed the Borg and they were unable to cope, causing the Borg to be circumvented by the aliens and ultimately taken over. Whether this was the plan all along of the species or a plan to stop the Borg that backfired remains to be seen. Another theory comes from the licensed but not canon game called Star Trek Legacy. The idea is that the Borg was created by Voyager. The impression given is that this is Voyager from the Star Trek movies, the one that was lost, repaired by sentient machines, and ultimately would consider all organic life to be an infestation. Though, this is somewhat confusing as the Borg do not consider data to be worth anything, but let's ignore that for a second. It would seem to be the most popular idea as it ties in with continuity and explains whatever happened to Voyager after the movie itself. This could also tie into the Queen, where they needed a singular voice. They found this in a species of females that could sift through thousands of thoughts at once, bringing an order to chaos, as I've stated. The last piece has already been discussed, but is still technically a theory, that she is, as she said, always been a part of the collective. Perhaps she was the Queen or some hierarch when right before the organics lost all of their individuality. While not the most sexy, this is likely the best explanation at this point. But if we're being honest, right now we simply don't have enough information to know who the Borg Queen is, or what she is, or how she came about. In these cases, I generally just fall back on what's implied and the dialogue given, that she's always existed. However, this creates massive inconsistencies and it doesn't make a lot of sense. In this video, I will be discussing two conversations I had. One with previous Voyager writer Lisa Klink, and another an anonymous person associated with the actual Discovery show. I hate to Midnight's Edge this, but I gave my word that they would be anonymous if they were able to conclusively prove that they were affiliated with the show in a major way. Since they were able to do this, I will include their thoughts to a limited capacity. Though to be fair, their opinions largely mirror that of Lisa, so you can choose to take my word for it or only listen to the parts that I include with Lisa. The questions I asked Lisa will be included in the description below. As has been stated, Star Trek Voyager was one of the least liked series in the entire franchise. This was probably due to a lot of reasons. Looking at the Nielsen ratings, we can't completely blame it on the writing of Voyager. Breaking it down, The Next Generation would ironically be the highest rated Trek series, followed by the original series, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and then Enterprise. From the research I could gather, the dip began during the time that the writers of DS9 decided to differentiate themselves from TNG. Because they wanted to be different, they took a stand of not your grandpa's Star Trek. They would have characters that broke the Prime Directive and still portrayed it as being okay and the officers as the good guys. Starfleet would be more militaristic, and if the writers had to bend continuity a bit, they would. They also wouldn't necessarily respect original works. This is most blatant in how the mirror universe was treated. In Voyager, this mentality carried over, but there was also the pressure of having lower ratings both from DS9 and from Voyager. They were also on a network that was outright dishonest with the advertising. Just trust me, Voyager advertising makes Discovery look like it actually cares and was being true to the original series representation, at least in some instances. So before I get into it, let me say this. Both the person with Discovery and Lisa Klink appear in all ways to care a lot about Star Trek, telling stories of the universe and even its continuity. A lot of you will scoff at this, but I sincerely believe it to be the case. I hold these opinions not only due to the conversations I've just had, but other interactions that I've had with people who work within the industry. And I truly believe that any extreme continuity issues or outright disdain for what came before can be thrown directly at the feet of showrunners and some of the executives, especially in the case of Discovery. And it's unfortunate because people will forget that in show business, Business is a part of it. The entire point, from the original series to Discovery, is to make money, however you have to. So if executives and showrunners have to bend continuity or don't care in some instances, I'm not surprised. Writers, while not being as focused on the bottom line, will state that they care more about the story over continuity. In fact, Lisa challenged me when I asked her about what she thought of my criticisms of Discovery. She asked me how I liked the show if we removed the words Star Trek. This was also basically echoed by the contact that works for Discovery. And to answer that question, both Discovery and Voyager would be mediocre space operas with interesting dynamics that they never realized, and ultimately, they were just held back by themselves. They could have achieved greatness and didn't. Voyager showed that it could rival Battlestar Galactica when it came to how it handled some topics, just with a Trek spin. But most of it was never fully realized. Discovery is the Expanse if you remove the grittiness and ability to bring plot lines together cohesively. Both aren't really that great, and if you add the Star Trek name to it, they just miss the mark. They do no favors to the franchise. All that to say, I think that the writers of the various Star Trek series probably fell into a similar specific mentality. All of them that I've spoke to generally tell me the same thing, that they wanted to honor Star Trek but weren't above writing inconsistent things. They wanted to write good stories first, and in their opinion, a good story is better than continuity. And looking at it from a cynical point of view, that would hopefully lead to better ratings and more money for everyone. This last piece being my words, not theirs. This is, in my opinion, why Discovery is the way it is, because those who create Trek now can't do the storytelling of old. I sincerely believe that no one would watch TNG right now if it was to air like it did back then. And storytelling itself has changed drastically. Hell, to be honest, I am not convinced there is any show that is comparable to TNG, DS9, or Voyager in the quote-unquote lighthearted mannerisms and the way that it worked today. A lot of people will say Orville is the new Star Trek, but that's a comedy. Trek fans would not be open to a comedy. Just look at how open people are to the newest animation that is going to be a Star Trek series. It's basically a comedy. So all that to say, I don't know that Star Trek in the way that we all remember it could work today. So how does all of this tie into the Borg? Because that's probably why you clicked on the video, and I've included this episode as a part of that series. Obviously, the Borg of Wolf 359 are nothing like that of the Borg in the Voyager series finality. And definitively, they are not the Borg in Discovery, if indeed that is the Borg. The Borg of Voyager are villains of the week, with a centralized power structure and a hierarchy that is defeated by one ship and one captain in a very, very contrived way. While it was executives in the First Contact movie that insisted on a queen, the fleshing out of the concept was done in Voyager because the writers thought that the storytelling of the past couldn't work, that to get people to watch, they had to change it up. Whether you think that's a good idea or not is up to you individually, but take into account the last episode of Voyager matches the lowest ever episode of Star Trek Enterprise. So ultimately, in Voyager's case, do I blame the writers for the destruction of the Borg's continuity? Absolutely. According to Lisa, there was guidance, but they were never overruled by the executives, and the writers had more freedom than what we see in Discovery. Is that bad? Maybe. For me, someone who lives, eats, and breathes Star Trek, I think that it took a great story and enemy and watered them down. But I have to consider that I'm not the average viewer, and I want to challenge you if you're watching this, are you really the average viewer as well? It's possible that the average popcorn-eating person would have loved this. And as far as Discovery, do I blame the writers for what has occurred? Not really. According to my source, what I've read independently and a general consensus, the showrunners and the executives are far more authoritarian on Star Trek writers than they have been historically. It's really too bad the networks don't trust the writers like they used to. So all of this writing to say it is clear that there was a destruction of what the Borg were, their very essence, and it would be because of money. But honestly, we can only blame the writers to the extent that we are willing to blame ourselves. How many of us would stick to continuity if it meant our families couldn't eat when the show got canceled? And the same is even worse for Discovery. So I can't really be sure. I may ask Lisa to come on and maybe have a hangout where her and I can talk, but people try to use the critique that if Discovery didn't exist, there would be no Trek. And if this is what it takes, this is the story writing to have what we remember Trek be Trek, and I don't know, my counter is if Trek has to be this, then maybe there shouldn't be. Trek has a wonderful legacy. There are some problems and there are some greatness, but overall, It's really good. And if it had to end with Star Trek Enterprise, I don't think that would have been a bad thing. But what are your thoughts?